For 9 long years, I sacrificed every ounce of my retirement, my life savings, and my own physical health to build my daughter a $1 million logistics company from scratch. But when I sat down at our quarterly board meeting, she slid a manila folder across the polished mahogany table and told me I was fired. I walked out without shedding a single tear. But by the time the sun went down, her biggest client was on the phone with me, and he asked one question that turned my heartbreak into absolute fury. The story opens in the sterile, glass-walled boardroom of Apex Heavy Logistics, the company I built from the ground up. My name is Thomas Sullivan. I am 69 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life managing heavy freight fleets for major infrastructure projects across this country. I know the smell of diesel fuel and hot asphalt better than I know the scent of expensive cologne. I know the sound of a turbocharged engine pulling 100,000 pounds of steel up a mountain grade. I am a man who built his life on hard work, sweat, and a handshake that actually meant something. When my beloved wife Sarah passed away 9 years ago, the silence in my house became unbearable. I needed a purpose. My daughter Chloe had just finished her business degree and was bursting with ambition, but she had absolutely no capital to start her own business. So I made a choice that any loving father would make. I drained my entire retirement fund. I went down to the bank and mortgaged the 4-bedroom home I had already paid off years ago. I ignored the grinding arthritis in my failing knees, and I personally went out and bought the initial fleet of specialized heavy transport rigs. I handed the keys to Chloe so she could be the CEO of her very own firm. I put on a hard hat and managed the yards, the maintenance, and the drivers while she handled the corporate clients. We were a team, or so I foolishly believed. That brings me to this morning. I walked into the Apex corporate headquarters. The boardroom was freezing cold, smelling of expensive glass cleaner and freshly brewed espresso. The walls were made of frosted glass, and the table was a massive slab of polished mahogany. I sat down in my usual leather chair. My hands, thick and scarred from decades of working around heavy machinery, rested on the pristine wood. I was fully expecting to review the deployment schedule for the massive new interstate bridge contract we had just secured. Instead, the door opened and Chloe walked in. She was wearing a tailored designer suit that probably cost more than my first truck. But it was the man walking in right behind her that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Bradley Hayes. Chloe had married Bradley 3 years ago, and from the day I met him at the country club, I knew he was a man who preferred taking shortcuts over doing the heavy lifting. He wore a custom-tailored navy blue suit, a gold watch flashing on his wrist, and a smug, relaxed smile that instantly put my guard up. They sat across from me. Chloe refused to look me in the eye. She opened her leather portfolio, pulled out a thick manila folder, and slid it directly across the table until it touched my hands. I looked at the folder, then at my daughter. I asked her what this was all about. Chloe finally looked up, but her eyes were completely blank. The warmth, the respect, the loving daughter I had raised was completely gone. She was replaced by a cold corporate detachment that chilled me to my core. She folded her hands on the table and spoke in a monotone voice. She told me that they were restructuring the executive board. She said Apex was moving in a new, modernized direction, courting a different tier of wealthy investors. Then, looking down her nose at me, she said my image was outdated. She called me too blue-collar. She actually said my presence in the yard and the boardroom was bad for their new corporate image. She finished by telling me that my services were no longer needed. I sat there in absolute silence. The words hit me so hard they knocked the breath right out of my lungs. Outdated. Too blue-collar. This entire company only existed because I bet my life savings on her success. I bought the trucks. I hired the mechanics. I secured our first massive contracts because the men in this industry trusted my reputation and my word. Before I could even process the absolute betrayal coming from my own flesh and blood, Bradley leaned forward. He rested his elbows on the table, interlacing his perfectly manicured fingers. He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile and delivered the killing blow. He smugly added that they were buying out my minority shares for pennies on the dollar. When I started to object, he laughed and told me I should read the original incorporation paperwork. 9 years ago, sitting at my kitchen table, still deep in mourning over my dead wife, Sarah, I had signed a stack of legal papers Chloe handed me. I didn't hire an outside lawyer to review them because she was my daughter. I trusted her implicitly. Bradley gleefully pointed out that there was a legal loophole in those papers. I had blindly signed a waiver granting Chloe majority voting rights with a forced buyout clause at par value, not current market value. "We are paying you pennies on the dollar, Thomas," he said with a smirk, "and it is completely legally binding. Your security badge has already been deactivated." The air in the room felt incredibly thin. I looked down at the folder in front of me. They had weaponized my own trust to steal my life's work. I looked at Chloe. I searched her face for any sign of remorse, any glimmer of the little girl who used to ride on my shoulders, any trace of the woman who cried in my arms at her mother's funeral. There was nothing. Just cold, calculated greed. She was completely intoxicated by the country club lifestyle, the social status, and the wealth. She had allowed a slick, manipulative parasite of a husband to convince her to cut the throat of the man who gave her everything. The pain in my chest was agonizing. It felt like a physical heart attack. The betrayal was so sharp, so deep, that for a moment the sterile boardroom spun around me. But I am a man who has spent his life working around heavy freight and dangerous equipment. I do not panic. I do not collapse under pressure. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I did not beg. I did not shout. I did not flip the table or threaten them with lawsuits I could not afford. I simply stood up. My knees popped loudly in the quiet room, a harsh echoing reminder of the physical toll this logistics company had taken on my aging body. I looked Bradley dead in the eyes until his smug smile faltered and he nervously shifted in his expensive leather chair. Then I looked at Chloe. I did not say a single word. I didn't need to. I left the severance folder sitting on the table, turned my back on the two of them, and walked to the door. The walk from the boardroom to the main exit felt like an eternity. I passed the dispatch desks, the accounting cubicles, and the framed photographs on the wall showing the massive transport rigs I had personally inspected and purchased. A few of the older employees, men and women I had hired myself, looked up at me. They saw the grim look on my face and quickly averted their eyes, pretending to look at their computer screens. They knew. Bradley had probably been planning this boardroom ambush for months, quietly lining up the staff, replacing my loyalists, orchestrating this precise moment of humiliation. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped out into the blinding midday sun. The intense heat of the asphalt hit me, carrying the familiar, comforting smell of diesel and hot rubber. I walked to my pickup truck, an old, reliable domestic model that sat in stark contrast to the imported luxury sports cars parked in the executive spots. I climbed inside, gripped the steering wheel with both hands, and just sat there. The emotional weight was crushing. My chest heaved, and a painful lump formed in my throat, but the tears did not fall. I was far too empty to cry. I had gambled my retirement, my home, my body, and my entire legacy on my own daughter, and I had been thrown out like a piece of garbage. I started the engine and drove. I did not know where I was going. I just needed to put physical distance between myself and the sterile glass building that represented my ruined life. I drove for hours, taking the winding back roads, watching the endless miles of pine trees and chain-link fences roll by. My mind raced, trying frantically to figure out how I was going to survive. I had almost no savings left. My house was still carrying a heavy mortgage because of the business loan I took out for Chloe. I was 69 years old, staring down the barrel of personal bankruptcy and complete financial ruin. Eventually, as the late afternoon shadows started to stretch long and dark across the asphalt, I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a rundown roadside diner. It was a quiet place, frequented by long-haul truckers, a place where no one would look twice at an older man sitting entirely alone with a cup of black coffee. I went inside, sat in a cracked vinyl booth all the way in the back corner, and ordered a coffee from the waitress. I stared out the dirty window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a bruised purple and orange glow across the sky. I took a slow sip of the bitter, scalding coffee. I was trying to map out my next move. Would I have to sell my family home? Could I find work as a freight consultant? Who would hire a blue-collar man my age in today's corporate world? The quiet hum of the diner refrigerator and the soft clinking of silverware were the only sounds keeping me grounded in reality. Then my cell phone buzzed violently in my chest pocket. It startled me. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed a name I knew very well. Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling was the CEO of Sterling Infrastructure Development. His company was an absolute titan in the commercial construction industry, responsible for building massive bridges, dams, and highway overpasses across the state. More importantly, Richard Sterling was Apex Heavy Logistics' biggest client. His contracts made up 80% of our total annual revenue. Richard was an old-school, hard-nosed businessman. He demanded absolute perfection, rigorous safety standards, and flawless execution on every single job. And the only reason he gave his multi-million-dollar contracts to Apex was because he knew me. We had sat down over a steak dinner 5 years ago, looked each other directly in the eye, and I gave him my personal guarantee that every piece of heavy machinery moved by my trucks would arrive safely maintained to the highest possible standard. He didn't trust Chloe. He didn't trust Bradley. He trusted Thomas Sullivan. I hesitated for a moment, watching the phone vibrate in my calloused hand. Why was he calling my personal cell phone after business hours? Did Chloe already call him to tell him I was gone? Was he calling to offer his corporate condolences before moving his massive account to a competitor? I took a deep breath, cleared the exhaustion from my throat, and pressed the answer button. "Hello, Richard," I said, trying to keep my voice as steady and professional as possible. There was no pleasant greeting on the other end of the line. There was no small talk about the weather or the upcoming interstate bridge project. There was only the sound of a man who was absolutely furious, a man barely containing his rage. Thomas Richards' voice barked through the phone speaker, harsh and demanding. "What the hell is your son-in-law trying to slip into our contract?" The question hung in the air, echoing in the quiet diner. The agonizing grief and the sorrow that had been paralyzing me for the last 6 hours instantly evaporated. It was immediately replaced by a sharp electric jolt of adrenaline. The puzzle pieces suddenly began to click together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Chloe and Bradley hadn't fired me just because of my blue-collar image. They hadn't humiliated me and stolen my life's work just because I was outdated. They fired me because they were trying to hide something massive, and my daily presence in the fleet yard was a direct threat to whatever corrupt financial scheme Bradley had quietly cooked up. I gripped the phone tightly, my knuckles turning white against the plastic casing. The setting sun cast a long, dark shadow across my diner table, and in that shadow the righteous indignation of a betrayed father who had been pushed too far began to ignite into a blazing, unstoppable inferno. The diner was empty when the cell phone vibrated against the cheap laminate table. I sat in the corner booth, staring at a cup of black coffee that had gone cold over the last hour. The sun had disappeared below the horizon, replacing the bright afternoon light with the harsh neon glow from the parking lot outside. My chest felt incredibly heavy. The memory of my own daughter sliding that severance folder across the boardroom table played on a continuous loop in my mind. She had looked at me with such cold detachment. She had called my decades of hard work outdated. She had told me I was too blue-collar for her new corporate image. I was 69 years old, and I had sacrificed my entire retirement savings to build Apex Heavy Logistics for her. Now, I was left with nothing but a mortgaged home and a broken heart. When the phone screen lit up, the caller identification displayed the name Richard Sterling. Richard was the chief executive of Sterling Infrastructure Development. His commercial construction company was responsible for building the largest highway overpasses and suspension bridges in the state. His corporate contracts accounted for 80% of the total revenue at Apex Heavy Logistics. Richard was a traditional old-school businessman who valued a firm handshake and absolute integrity above all else. He only awarded those multi-million-dollar freight contracts to our company because he trusted my personal oversight. He knew I inspected every single heavy transport rig. He did not trust Chloe, and he certainly did not trust her slick country club husband, Bradley. I cleared my throat and answered the call. I fully expected Richard to ask about the complex delivery schedule for the upcoming interstate bridge project. Instead, his voice blasted through the small phone speaker with absolute fury. He demanded to know what on earth my son-in-law was trying to slip into the new corporate contract. I sat up straight in the vinyl booth, gripping the phone tightly. I asked him to calm down and explain exactly what he meant. Richard explained that Bradley had sent over a revised maintenance agreement just an hour ago. The new document attempted to completely rewrite the strict safety protocols I had personally established. When hauling 80,000 pounds of raw steel and concrete across crowded public highways, safety is not a suggestion. It is the only thing preventing a massive catastrophic tragedy. My protocols required our mechanics to perform daily hydraulic tests, rigorous brake calibrations, and load stress evaluations before any truck left the yard. Richard revealed that Bradley had secretly altered the contract to mandate only basic monthly inspections. Even worse, Bradley had written in a clause to replace our highly trained certified union mechanics with cheap uncertified contract labor to cut costs. Richard was furious because Bradley had attempted to sneak these dangerous revisions into the final draft, claiming that I had personally approved them right before my sudden retirement. The sheer audacity of the lie left me momentarily speechless. Richard told me he was preparing to cancel the entire contract immediately. He refused to do business with a logistics company that treated public highway safety like a corner-cutting exercise. As I listened to the anger radiating from Richard, the puzzle pieces of my ruined morning violently clicked together in my mind. The agonizing grief that had been paralyzing me vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating realization. Chloe and Bradley had not fired me because I was outdated or bad for their new corporate image. That entire boardroom speech was a calculated smokescreen. They ambushed me and forced me out of my own company because I was the only person who audited the daily maintenance logs. They knew I would never allow them to compromise the safety of our freight fleet. The truth was entirely financial. By eliminating the daily safety checks and firing the certified mechanics, Bradley was planning to slash the operating budget by 90%. He was trying to pocket the massive difference in cash. My own daughter was risking the lives of innocent families on the highway and destroying the immaculate reputation I had spent 40 years building just to fund her lavish lifestyle. The sorrow in my heart burned away, leaving behind a righteous indignation. They had weaponized my trust to steal my life's work, and now they were going to ruin the company to buy more luxury cars and country club memberships. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I did not yell, and I did not panic. I have spent my entire life managing heavy machinery and dangerous situations. I know how to remain calm under extreme pressure. I apologized to Richard for the fraudulent contract. Then I asked him for a massive personal favor. I asked him to give me exactly 48 hours before he pulled the corporate contract. I promised him I would handle the situation internally and expose whatever corrupt financial scheme Bradley was running behind closed doors. Richard hesitated. He was a businessman, and he fully understood the severe legal liabilities involved. But he also remembered the time I personally drove a transport rig through a torrential storm to ensure his project met its deadline. Because of our deep mutual respect, he agreed to my request. He told me I had 2 days to fix the rot inside my company. If the original safety protocols were not legally restored by Monday morning, he would formally terminate every single active project and bankrupt Apex Heavy Logistics. I ended the call and placed the phone on the table. I stared out the dirty window at my worn pickup truck. I knew I could not just go home, sit in my empty living room and wallow in self-pity. I am a man who built his life with his own 2 hands. When a foundation is crumbling, you do not cry about it. You grab your tools and you fix it. My blue-collar grit kicked in, washing away the fatigue in my aging bones. I stood up, left a $5 bill on the table for the cold coffee, and walked out into the dark night. I drove my truck through the winding back roads toward the Apex Fleet Yard. The industrial park was located on the desolate outskirts of the city, surrounded by dense pine trees and tall chain-link fences. By the time I arrived, it was the dead of night. The gravel lot was silent, illuminated only by the sickly yellow glow of sodium streetlights shining through the heavy fog. I knew Bradley would have security looking out for my truck, so I parked 2 blocks away behind an old warehouse. I walked the remaining distance on foot, stepping carefully through the damp grass to avoid making noise. The cold night air bit through my thin jacket, but I did not slow down. I knew every single inch of this facility because I had poured the concrete foundation myself. I navigated through the deep shadows, expertly avoiding the sweeping angles of the perimeter security cameras. I reached the side entrance of the main dispatch building. The steel door was controlled by an electronic scanner. During the boardroom ambush, Bradley had smugly declared my security access was already revoked. However, I knew from experience that our corporate information technology department was notoriously slow. They rarely updated the system on a Friday evening, leaving administrative tasks for Monday morning. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my worn plastic keycard. I held my breath and swiped it across the magnetic reader. A second of agonizing silence passed. Then the small light turned green, and the heavy locking mechanism clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. I slipped inside the dark building, closing the door behind me to ensure it did not latch loudly. The familiar scent of diesel fuel, stale coffee, and old paperwork filled my lungs. The dispatch center was empty, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the horizontal window blinds. I moved quietly down the hallway, trusting my memory to guide me past the empty cubicles. I reached the main dispatch office at the end of the corridor. This room contained the central server terminals that controlled every piece of data in the company. I sat down in the leather chair, feeling a strange sense of trespass in the very room I had designed. I pressed the power button on the computer. The large monitor flickered to life, casting a bright blue glow across my scarred, calloused hands. I did not use my standard user profile, knowing they had likely locked that account. Instead, I typed in a secret backdoor administrative password I created with the original software developer 9 years ago. The system accepted the credentials immediately. I navigated straight past the daily schedules and opened the restricted financial ledgers and fleet maintenance logs. I pulled a high-capacity flash drive from my jacket pocket and inserted it into the terminal. I selected years of hidden transaction histories, offshore wire transfers, and falsified maintenance reports, dragging them all into the backup folder. The computer displayed a loading bar indicating the massive download would take several minutes to complete. I sat back in the chair, watching the digital progress percentage slowly climb. The silence of the night was heavy and oppressive. I listened to the hum of the computer fan, feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I was going to uncover the exact depth of their betrayal. I was going to secure the undeniable proof I needed to save my grandchildren from the corrupt empire my daughter was building. Suddenly, the absolute quiet of the fleet yard was violently shattered. The harsh, heavy crunch of tires rolling over thick gravel echoed from the front parking lot. I froze completely. Two bright beams of light from a vehicle's headlamps swept aggressively across the window blinds, illuminating the dust floating in the dispatch office. I immediately reached out and dimmed the computer monitor to its lowest setting, plunging the room back into protective darkness. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I crept toward the window and carefully separated two slats of the horizontal blinds with my index finger. A sleek, imported luxury sedan had parked directly in front of the main glass entrance. The engine was cut, and the headlights turned off. I heard the solid thud of the driver's side door slamming shut. A moment later, a voice echoed across the empty yard. It was loud, arrogant, and dripping with unearned confidence. I recognized it instantly. It was Bradley. My grip tightened on the window blind. What was my son-in-law doing at the industrial fleet yard at this hour of the night? He despised the dirt and the smell of the dispatch center, preferring to spend his evenings sipping expensive scotch at his exclusive country club. I watched him walk into the pale glow of the security light. He was wearing a tailored suit, looking incredibly smug and relaxed. He was not alone. The passenger side door opened, and a figure stepped out onto the gravel. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels approaching the front of the vehicle. A woman walked around the luxury sedan and stepped into the light to join Bradley. She possessed long, dark hair and wore a form-fitting dress that was inappropriate for a corporate logistics yard. She reached out playfully, grabbing Bradley by the lapels of his expensive jacket. She threw her head back and let out a high-pitched, echoing laugh that sent a freezing chill straight down my spine. I stared through the narrow gap in the window blinds, feeling my blood turn to absolute ice. The woman leaning against my son-in-law in the middle of the night, whispering secrets into his ear as they prepared to enter the dark building, was absolutely not my daughter. The dispatch office was completely pitch black, except for the small blue indicator lights blinking steadily on the main server racks in the far corner. I crouched down low behind a tall row of heavy metal filing cabinets inside the dusty records room. I held my breath, listening intently to the oppressive, heavy silence of the industrial fleet yard. My knees ached terribly against the cold, hard linoleum floor. It was a harsh physical reminder of the 40 long years I had spent climbing in and out of massive, heavy transport trucks. The air in the cramped room was stale, carrying the faint, deeply familiar scent of aged paper, bitter spilled coffee, and the thick diesel fuel that seemed to permanently cling to my old work clothes. I had built this entire logistics facility with my own two calloused hands, pouring the foundation and framing the walls, and now I was forced to hide inside it like a common criminal, stealing in the night. The sudden harsh crunch of expensive rubber tires rolling aggressively over the gravel parking lot outside violently shattered the quiet night. I froze, entirely pressing my back flat against the cold metal of the cabinet. A sweeping beam of bright white light from a pair of luxury vehicle headlamps slashed directly through the horizontal window blinds. The intense light danced erratically across the dark room, illuminating the thick dust particles floating in the stagnant air before the car engine was abruptly cut off. I heard the heavy, solid thud of a vehicle door slamming shut, followed immediately by the sound of a second door closing. Footsteps began to echo clearly on the concrete walkway leading up to the main dispatch entrance. I recognized the arrogant, heavy stride immediately. It was Bradley. But I could also hear that he was not alone. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of a woman's high heels accompanied his heavy footsteps tapping loudly against the pavement. I reached carefully into the inner pocket of my worn canvas jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I quickly turned the screen brightness all the way down to complete darkness so the glowing light would not give away my hiding position. I opened the voice recording application, pressed the large red button to capture the audio, and slipped the phone safely into my front shirt pocket. I waited in the deep shadows, my heart hammering furiously against my ribcage. The electronic security lock on the main dispatch door clicked open with a loud, sharp, metallic snap. The heavy glass door swung wide, and the bright overhead fluorescent lights were violently flicked on. The sudden blinding illumination spilled directly into the records room, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor where I was hiding. Through a narrow 2-inch gap between the tall filing cabinets, I had a perfectly clear line of sight into the main office area. Bradley walked in first, strutting with unearned confidence. He was wearing his custom-tailored navy blue suit, looking entirely out of place in a blue-collar working logistics yard. He casually loosened his expensive silk tie and laughed aloud. Following right behind him was a woman I recognized instantly, and the sight of her made my stomach turn over. It was Jessica. She was the lead corporate accountant for Apex Heavy Logistics. During regular business hours, Jessica was a quiet, unassuming professional who always wore modest clothing and kept her head down behind her dual computer monitors managing the payroll and the vendor accounts. Right now, she was wearing a tight red dress and holding a large, expensive bottle of imported champagne. She walked up behind my son-in-law, wrapped her arms intimately around his waist, rested her chin on his shoulder, and let out a loud, cruel laugh that echoed sharply off the dispatch walls. The sickening reality of the situation washed over me in a wave of pure disgust. Bradley was not just stealing my company and emotionally manipulating my daughter. He was carrying on a blatant, arrogant affair right under her nose with the very woman responsible for managing the financial lifeblood of the entire corporation. They walked directly over to the main computer server terminal in the center of the room. Bradley set a pair of crystal glasses on the wooden desk and loudly popped the cork on the champagne bottle. The festive sound of the celebration felt like a physical knife twisting deep in my gut. They were celebrating my destruction. They were toasting to the ruin of my life's work. I held my breath, remaining perfectly still, making absolutely sure my hidden phone was picking up every single word they said. Bradley took a large sip of his sparkling drink and smiled a sinister, self-satisfied smile. He reached out and booted up the main terminal. "Did you see the pathetic look on the old man's face today?" he asked, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He just sat there in that boardroom like a tired old dog and took his beating. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Jessica laughed again, a high and piercing sound that grated against my ears. Taking a slow sip from her glass, she leaned casually against the edge of the desk. "Chloe made it so incredibly easy," she replied, shaking her head in amusement. "Your wife is so completely desperate to maintain her precious status among the modern suburban elite. She signed the severance authorization and the forced buyout clause without even bothering to read the second page of the legal document. She was too busy talking on her phone to the luxury caterers about her upcoming corporate country club gala. She is so obsessed with her wealthy public image that she does not even know what she is signing anymore. I gritted my teeth together so hard my jaw began to ache with a sharp pain. Hearing them speak about my own daughter with such absolute, unfiltered contempt made my blood boil hot in my veins. I had sacrificed my entire life, drained my retirement accounts, and destroyed my physical health to give Chloe a successful business, and she was blindly handing the keys over to these two parasites just so she could pretend to be high society. Bradley chuckled darkly, typing his administrative password into the computer system with rapid keystrokes. "Chloe is completely blind," he said confidently. "She loves the prestigious title of Chief Executive Officer, but she absolutely despises the actual hard work required to run a logistics firm. As long as I keep telling her how beautiful she looks in her designer dresses and keep buying her expensive jewelry on the company credit line, she will sign absolutely whatever financial documents I put in front of her face. She actually thanked me this morning for handling the dirty work of firing her own father." My chest tightened painfully, restricting my ability to breathe. The psychological manipulation was absolute and total. Bradley had systematically isolated her, feeding her fragile ego, while quietly and ruthlessly orchestrating the hostile takeover of the company I built with my own sweat. The large computer monitor hummed to life, casting a pale, cold blue glow across Bradley's smug face. "It is absolutely perfect," he announced to Jessica, pointing at the screen. "With Thomas finally thrown out of the building, there is absolutely nobody left to audit the daily fleet maintenance logs. I can finally push the rest of the heavy machinery budget directly into our hidden shell companies." I listened in absolute paralyzing horror as the true depth of their criminal conspiracy was laid bare in the quiet room. Bradley began bragging extensively about a complex series of fake logistics consulting firms he had quietly registered in the state of Nevada. He boasted proudly about how he was systematically generating fake invoices for corporate services that were never rendered, forcing Jessica to digitally approve the fraudulent payments and draining the massive capital reserves of Apex Heavy Logistics. "The luxury condominium in Aspen is fully funded now," he said, pulling up a digital spreadsheet filled with endless rows of stolen numbers. "And the massive down payment for the new yacht cleared the offshore accounts yesterday morning. We are completely set for life. All we have to do is keep starving these transport trucks of their critical safety repairs for just 6 more months, and we will have enough untraceable cash to disappear to Europe entirely." I felt a cold, paralyzing dread wash over my entire body. Starving the heavy machinery of critical maintenance was not just a white-collar financial crime. It was a literal death sentence for innocent people. I am a man who knows heavy machinery. These specialized transport trucks haul 80,000 pounds of raw steel and solid concrete across crowded public highways every single day. They require meticulous care. Without daily hydraulic pressure tests, rigorous brake pad calibrations, and load-bearing axle inspections, a catastrophic mechanical failure was completely inevitable. A blown brake line on a steep mountain grade would turn one of my trucks into an unstoppable missile, destroying family minivans and school buses. Jessica traced her manicured finger along the edge of the wooden desk, looking slightly curious, but completely remorseless. "Are you absolutely sure the veteran drivers will not report the failing brakes and the bald tires to the Federal Transportation Authorities?" she asked, taking another sip of champagne. Bradley waved his hand dismissively, completely unbothered by the severe risk to human life. "Let them complain all they want," he sneered with cold arrogance. "We will just immediately fire anyone who refuses to drive the assigned unsafe routes. We will replace the union men with cheap, uncertified contract labor who do not speak English and do not ask any questions about safety protocols. Chloe will happily sign their termination papers without blinking an eye. She just wants to pretend she is a self-made millionaire. She does not care how the money is made, as long as the checks keep clearing. I remained completely frozen in the dark shadows of the records room, my hidden phone silently recording every single disgusting word of their federal confession. They stood there drinking the stolen champagne for another 20 minutes, laughing loudly about their newly acquired wealth and openly mocking the hard-working blue-collar men who were risking their lives every day in those dangerously unsafe trucks. Finally, Bradley closed out the active window on the terminal and grabbed his luxury car keys off the desk. "Come on," he said, adjusting the lapels of his expensive suit jacket. "Let us get out of this dirty industrial yard before the smell of cheap diesel fuel permanently ruins my clothing. We have a very early private flight to Aspen tomorrow morning to sign the final property deeds on the condo." They walked confidently out of the main office, turning off the bright overhead lights and plunging the room back into protective darkness. The heavy glass front door slammed shut behind them, automatically locking with a loud, heavy click. I waited in the absolute pitch-black darkness, listening closely and holding my breath until I heard the powerful engine of his luxury sedan start up in the parking lot. The tires crunched heavily over the loose gravel as they drove rapidly away, leaving the isolated fleet yard in total oppressive silence once again. I stood up very slowly. My aging knees throbbed with a dull, heavy, agonizing pain from crouching on the hard floor for so long, but the intense, righteous fury burning inside my chest pushed the physical exhaustion entirely away. I was no longer a broken, defeated old man. I was a father preparing for war. I walked quickly and quietly out of the records room and moved directly over to the main server terminal. Bradley was incredibly arrogant, but his arrogance made him incredibly sloppy. He had locked the primary viewing screen, but he had carelessly left his secure administrative session actively logged in on the secondary background server. I pulled my high-capacity digital flash drive from my jacket pocket and plugged it directly into the secure USB port on the back of the machine. I quickly bypassed the simple screensaver and accessed the restricted root directories of the company network. I immediately began downloading the complete unedited financial ledgers. I copied years of the fraudulent Nevada shell company invoices, the highly illegal falsified maintenance logs, and the untraceable offshore wire transfers that funded his lavish Aspen lifestyle. I watched the green digital progress bar slowly fill across the center of the monitor, securing the undeniable concrete evidence that would inevitably put my arrogant son-in-law in a federal penitentiary for a very long time. But just as the massive data download successfully completed, a completely separate, highly encrypted folder hidden deep on the network drive caught my attention. It was obscurely labeled with a strange string of personal routing numbers, totally separated from the standard corporate accounting structures. I clicked the secure folder open, driven by a desperate need to see exactly how deep this financial rot truly went. As my tired eyes scanned the digital ledgers populating on the bright screen, my breath caught violently in my dry throat. These were not company accounts. They were a completely separate set of personal financial files. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the sheer volume of money that had been moved in the dark. And then, as I scrolled down to the most recent transaction history, I noticed a massive catastrophic withdrawal from this separate set of personal accounts. The money had been completely drained in a single unauthorized digital transfer, leaving a zero balance staring back at me. The cold glow of the computer monitor illuminated my scarred face in the dark, empty office, and as the true, horrifying reality of what that specific account actually represented finally hit my brain, I felt my blood run completely freezing cold. The sun rose over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting a pale and weak light through the blinds of my kitchen window. But there was absolutely no warmth in it. I sat alone at the scratched wooden table. A mug of black coffee was growing cold between my calloused hands. My physical body was completely exhausted. My knees throbbed with a dull and heavy ache from crouching in the dark shadows of the fleet yard the night before. My back was incredibly stiff from decades of hauling heavy freight and managing massive machinery. But my mind was wide awake. It was racing with a terrifying and electric clarity. I had not slept a single minute. The image of my arrogant son-in-law Bradley laughing in the dispatch office with his mistress Jessica was burned permanently into my mind. They had mocked my lifetime of hard work. They had celebrated kicking me out of the logistics company I built from the dirt up. They were deliberately starving the transport rigs of critical safety maintenance. They were risking the lives of innocent highway drivers just to fund a luxury lifestyle. I took a slow and bitter sip of the coffee. I let the harsh caffeine fuel the righteous anger that was keeping me upright. On the table in front of me sat my heavy grease-stained laptop and the small digital flash drive containing the complete financial ledgers of Apex Heavy Logistics. I had already secured the concrete evidence of their corporate fraud. But there was one final and highly encrypted folder I had downloaded in the dead of night. It was a folder completely separated from the standard company accounts. I took a deep breath. I opened the laptop and prepared to uncover the absolute bottom of their betrayal. The computer fan hummed in the silent kitchen. It was a low mechanical drone that felt deafening in the empty house. I clicked on the obscure folder. It was locked behind a complex security firewall. But Bradley was a man who relied entirely on the intelligence of others. He had used a standard financial encryption software. My old union accountant had warned me about this specific program years ago. It took me less than 20 minutes of running a basic decryption sequence to crack the password. A digital progress bar filled across the screen. It turned from red to a sickly green before the folder violently snapped open. I leaned forward in my chair. My tired eyes scanned the rows of digital spreadsheets and banking routing numbers. I fully expected to find more shell companies. I thought I would see hidden offshore accounts or illegal kickback ledgers tied to uncertified contract labor. But as I read the headers of the bank statements, my blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. These were not corporate accounts. They had absolutely nothing to do with Apex Heavy Logistics or the heavy freight maintenance budgets. The routing numbers were deeply and intimately familiar to me. They were the specific identification codes for the private educational trust funds I had personally established 9 years ago. My heart began to hammer frantically against my ribs. Liam and Emma, my 2 beautiful and innocent grandchildren. After my beloved wife Sarah passed away, those kids became the absolute center of my entire universe. I did not just sacrifice my physical health and my retirement savings to build a company for my daughter Chloe. I poured every extra penny and every overtime bonus and every single drop of my sweat into securing an impenetrable future for those children. I established those trust funds with strict legal instructions. They were solely for their elite education and personal development. I wanted them to have the amazing opportunities I never had growing up in a harsh blue-collar world. I funded the absolute best private tutoring available. I paid for immersive language instructors because I knew the modern world demanded absolute brilliance. Because of my investment and their own incredible intelligence, Liam and Emma already read, write, and speak English, Italian, and German perfectly. They would sit right here at this very kitchen table. They would switch effortlessly between 3 different languages while eating Sunday breakfast. I was so unbelievably proud of them. I even started buying them picture books and audio lessons to learn a 4th language. I was constantly reminding them that Mandarin is the language of the future, and they needed to be ready for the global stage. They were my living legacy. They were the pure and untainted light in my life. and I had trusted Chloe to act as the legal guardian of those accounts. I truly believed a mother would protect her children with her dying breath. With a trembling index finger, I clicked on the most recent monthly statement for Liam's account. The screen refreshed slowly. The harsh digital numbers burned directly into my retinas. The balance was 0. My breath caught violently in my throat. It felt like I was choking on broken glass. I frantically clicked on Emma's trust fund. 0. I pulled up the comprehensive transaction history. My eyes darted frantically across the screen, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the financial slaughter. Over the last 18 months, while I was busy crawling under heavy transport rigs and managing massive freight schedules, Bradley had been systematically liquidating my grandchildren's future. He had not just siphoned a few $1,000s here and there. He had entirely drained the massive trusts down to the very last cent. I traced the digital wire transfers. I followed the stolen money trail with a sickening and heavy dread. The funds had not gone to private school tuition. They had not gone to educational travel or academic programs. Bradley had transferred the money into high-risk private brokerage accounts completely under his own name. He had been making massive and reckless financial bets on highly volatile tech stocks. He was playing the stock market like a degenerate gambler at a cheap casino. When the financial market inevitably turned against him, he received devastating margin calls. The brokers demanded immediate cash to cover his massive trading losses. Instead of taking the loss and facing reality, he covered his massive debts by stealing the money I had bled to save for Liam and Emma. The realization hit me with the physical force of a speeding freight train. Bradley could not have executed these massive bank transfers alone. The trust accounts required the primary guardian's digital authorization for any major withdrawal. I pulled up the security signature logs. There, on every single catastrophic withdrawal, was Chloe's electronic signature. My own flesh and blood. My own daughter. She had blindly signed away her children's entire future. As I stared at her digital signature, the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Chloe was completely and hopelessly consumed by her desperate need to maintain her image among the modern suburban elite. She was obsessed with the lavish country club galas. She was intoxicated by the expensive designer dresses and the luxury cars. She lived for the fake illusion of immense corporate wealth. She was so blinded by her social status that she had completely neglected her own children. She had handed Bradley absolute and unchecked financial control of their entire lives simply because it allowed her to avoid the hard work of actual parenting and financial management. She did not even bother to read the financial documents he placed in front of her. She just signed them without a second thought so she could quickly return to sipping imported champagne with her wealthy, superficial friends. She had allowed a manipulative parasite of a husband to steal her children's education to cover his pathetic gambling debts. For a very long time, I just sat there in the silent kitchen, staring at the glowing computer screen. The betrayal was so profound and so absolute that it felt as though the very floorboards beneath my feet had completely collapsed. A heavy and suffocating sorrow washed over my entire body. I lowered my scarred face into my calloused hands, and I wept silently. I did not cry for the loss of my logistics company. I did not cry for my own stolen retirement funds or my exhausted physical body. I cried for Liam and Emma. I cried for the innocent children who were currently living in a fragile house of lies. They were completely unaware that their father was a ruthless criminal and their mother was a negligent and status-obsessed fool. I cried because the safety net I had painstakingly built for them had been maliciously shredded into pieces. But as the morning sun finally broke fully over the horizon, it cast a bright and harsh light across my kitchen table. Slowly the tears stopped falling. The agonizing grief that had been paralyzing my heart began to evaporate. It was rapidly replaced by something else entirely. A cold and unyielding and terrifying rage began to crystallize deep inside my chest. I wiped my wet face with the back of my scarred hand, and I stood up. I am a man who has spent over 40 years moving mountains of raw steel and solid concrete. I know how to build unbreakable foundations, and I know exactly how to tear them down to the bare dirt. They did not just steal my minority shares of a logistics firm. They did not just humiliate me in a sterile glass boardroom. They stole my grandchildren's bright future. That was the one line they should never have crossed. I looked down at the digital flash drive containing the undeniable evidence of their absolute financial ruin. I swore a silent and unbreakable oath right there in my lonely kitchen. I would not just reclaim my logistics company. I would completely and utterly destroy the corrupt empire they had built on my broken back. I would systematically dismantle their fake, luxurious life, piece by piece. I would ensure they faced the most severe federal legal penalties available. They wanted to play a ruthless corporate game, but they forgot that I am the man who taught them how to play. The sorrow was entirely gone now. My blue-collar grit hardened my resolve. I was going to fight back with an intelligence and a ferocity they could never anticipate. I was going to take everything from them, and I was going to save Liam and Emma, no matter what it cost me. The morning sun rising over the city skyline felt like a harsh spotlight illuminating my absolute failure as a father and a businessman, but I refused to let the blinding light paralyze me. I was not going to march back into the Apex Heavy Logistics corporate office and throw a screaming emotional fit. That is exactly what a wounded, desperate animal does, and Bradley would have eagerly anticipated it. He would have used my anger against me. He would have called the building security team to physically escort me out, spun a convincing story to the board of directors about my rapidly declining mental health, and immediately accelerated his plan to move the stolen company funds into an untouchable offshore account. I needed to be entirely cold. I needed a weapon that Bradley could not charm, manipulate, or buy off. I needed a lawyer who knew how to fight in the absolute deepest mud without getting his own suit dirty. I sat in the cab of my pickup truck, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed a number I had not called in over 15 years. The man on the other end of the line was named Victor Harrison. Victor was a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney who operated out of a massive glass high-rise in downtown Chicago. Decades ago, back when I was just a tough union shop steward fighting against corrupt freight managers and dangerous working conditions, I saved Victor from a brutal local extortion racket that was threatening his family over a land dispute. I gathered a dozen of my largest union boys, and we made sure his particular problem disappeared into the night without a single police report ever being filed. Victor looked me dead in the eye that rainy evening and promised that if I ever needed a massive favor, no matter the legal risk or the corporate collateral damage, he would answer the call. When he answered the phone this morning, I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I was officially cashing in that 15-year-old chip. He did not hesitate or ask a single question. He simply told me to drive straight to his building and come up through the private secure parking garage elevator. I drove into the heart of the city with the digital flash drive sitting incredibly heavy in my canvas jacket pocket. It felt like I was carrying a live grenade. Victor's executive office was a sprawling, intimidating suite made of dark mahogany wood and panoramic floor-to-ceiling glass, presenting a stark, glaring contrast to the grease, diesel fuel, and grit of my everyday working world. He sat behind an immaculate desk. He was older now, his hair completely silver, and his face lined with age, but his dark eyes still possessed that exact same predatory, calculating sharpness that made him a terror in the courtroom. I walked across the plush carpet, pulled the flash drive from my pocket, and dropped it directly onto the center of his pristine desk. I told him that small piece of plastic contained the absolute destruction of my son-in-law, and I needed him to show me how to detonate it. Victor plugged the drive into an isolated, secure computer terminal on the edge of his desk and began to read. I stood quietly by the window, watching the heavy city traffic crawling along the avenues far below, listening to the steady, rhythmic clicking of his computer mouse. I watched his face carefully as his experienced eyes scanned the thousands of decrypted digital files. He reviewed the fraudulent Nevada shell companies, the highly illegal falsified heavy machinery maintenance logs, and the catastrophic, unforgivable wire transfers draining my grandchildren's educational trusts. For almost 45 minutes, the massive office was suffocatingly silent. Finally, Victor let out a long, heavy sigh, leaned back in his leather chair, and took off his reading glasses. He confirmed exactly what I had suspected in the dark dispatch office. Bradley was actively committing federal wire fraud, gross corporate embezzlement, and criminal malfeasance on a truly massive scale. Victor stated with absolute certainty that the digital evidence I had successfully extracted was entirely airtight. We could easily hand this flash drive over to the federal authorities this very afternoon, and Bradley would be wearing heavy steel handcuffs before the evening news broadcast. But then Victor leaned forward, steepling his fingers, and laid out the devastating, unavoidable reality of the federal legal system. He explained that if the authorities raided the Apex Heavy Logistics headquarters, they would be legally obligated to immediately freeze every single corporate bank account and physical asset. The entire logistics company would be instantly paralyzed. The massive fleet of transport trucks would be grounded. Our commercial infrastructure contracts would automatically default due to non-performance. Apex would be forced to file for total bankruptcy within a matter of weeks, and the resulting aggressive corporate liquidation would completely wipe out the remaining value of the firm. I would permanently lose everything I had spent 9 years building from the dirt up, and my daughter Chloe would be left holding a mountain of unpayable corporate debt that would ruin her life forever. Going straight to the police was a blunt, destructive instrument, and we desperately needed a scalpel. We needed to execute a precise surgical strike that would aggressively separate the cancer from the host without killing the patient in the process. I turned away from the window and walked back to his desk. I told Victor that I completely refused to let a manipulative parasite like Bradley destroy my hard-earned legacy and walk away clean. I asked him how we could trap the cornered rat without burning down the entire house we built. Victor smiled a very cold, deeply calculating smile. He told me that we needed to orchestrate a rapid, controlled corporate demolition. We needed to pull the financial rug out from under Bradley's custom-tailored shoes so incredibly fast that he would have absolutely no time to hide the stolen capital spin, a fake narrative, or flee the country. And to execute a maneuver that massive, we needed the immediate willing cooperation of the one man holding the ultimate purse strings to the entire Apex financial empire. We needed Richard Sterling. I arranged a highly secretive meeting with Richard later that same evening. We did not meet at a fancy downtown steakhouse or a comfortable climate-controlled corporate boardroom. I told him to meet me at a desolate, abandoned freight train yard on the far industrial edge of the county, a forgotten place where absolutely nobody would recognize his imported luxury town car. The evening sky had opened up, and the freezing rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets when Richard finally pulled into the gravel lot. He stepped out of the warm back seat of his vehicle, holding a large black umbrella, looking highly irritated, shivering in the damp cold, and deeply impatient with my theatrics. He did not bother to greet me. He simply pointed a finger at my chest and sternly reminded me that I only had 36 hours left to fix the fraudulent contract before he officially terminated the massive interstate bridge project and bankrupted my firm. I did not offer him any empty apologies or corporate excuses. I simply opened the heavy steel door of my pickup truck, reached inside, pulled out a thick stack of printed highlighted fleet maintenance logs, and handed them directly to him in the pouring rain. I told him to stop yelling and look closely at what my daughter and her husband were actually doing to the heavy transport fleet behind my back. Richard held a small tactical flashlight over the damp pages, shielding them from the heavy rain with his umbrella. I stood in the cold downpour and watched the intense annoyance on his face rapidly transform into absolute unadulterated horror. He saw the deliberately canceled hydraulic pressure tests. He saw the aggressively delayed brake pad calibrations on massive trucks tasked with carrying 80,000 pounds of raw steel across public highways. He saw the undeniable documentary proof that Bradley was actively replacing our highly trained certified union mechanics with cheap, completely uncertified contract labor just to pocket the monthly budget difference. Richard is a hard-nosed old-school builder who values innocent human life and rigorous structural integrity far above temporary corporate profit margins. He realized instantly that Bradley was not just running a standard white-collar financial scam. My son-in-law was deliberately risking a catastrophic, deadly highway disaster that would ultimately fall back on sterling infrastructure development and completely destroy their national reputation. Richard looked up at me, his face pale and tight in the harsh white beam of the flashlight. He was absolutely appalled. He demanded to know how I could have possibly let my own company rot from the inside out while innocent drivers were put at risk. I looked him dead in the eye, ignoring the freezing rain soaking through my canvas jacket. I explained that I had been completely blind, foolishly blinded by the unconditional love for my only daughter and the desperate, naive hope that her chosen husband was actually a decent, honorable man. I told him I had trusted family over facts, and it was the biggest mistake of my professional life. But I fiercely assured him that my eyes were wide open now, and I was ready to tear the building down to the foundation to fix it. I told Richard that if he simply canceled the commercial contract right now, in a fit of righteous anger, Bradley would immediately file for corporate bankruptcy protection, take the millions of dollars he had already stolen from the equipment budget and my grandchildren's trust funds, and easily disappear to a luxury estate in Europe before the authorities could even draft a warrant. I proposed a radical alternative. I laid out a secret, highly aggressive plan that would permanently secure his freight logistics while simultaneously locking Bradley inside an inescapable, crushing legal trap. Richard folded the damp maintenance papers, tucked them into his coat, and asked me exactly what I had in mind. I carefully explained the legal strategy Victor Harrison and I had spent the entire afternoon devising. Deep inside the original dense master contract signed between Sterling Infrastructure and Apex Heavy Logistics 9 years ago, there was a highly obscure, easily overlooked legal provision known as a key man clause. I had stubbornly insisted on adding it to the paperwork when we first incorporated the business. The clause explicitly and undeniably stated that the entire multi-million-dollar operational contract was strictly contingent upon my direct personal supervision of the freight fleet and the maintenance yards. If I was ever fired, forced to retire, or removed from my position of absolute operational authority, Richard had the ironclad legal right to declare the entire contract completely null and void, without providing any advance warning severance or financial penalty to the remaining executive board. Bradley and Chloe were so incredibly arrogant, so deeply blinded by their insatiable greed and their desperate rush to push me out the boardroom door that they had completely failed to review the original contract stipulations. They had absolutely no idea the key man clause even existed in the archives. I told Richard that we were going to use their own massive ego and staggering incompetence as the ultimate weapon to destroy them. I asked him to formally and legally exercise the clause immediately, but to keep the devastating termination completely silent and hidden from their accounting department for just a few more days. Richard agreed to the strategy immediately, eager to punish the man who tried to compromise his safety standards. But he quickly raised a critical, unavoidable logistical problem. If he officially terminated his relationship with Apex, he still had thousands of tons of heavy concrete and structural steel that absolutely needed to be moved to the bridge construction site by next Monday morning. He looked around the desolate, rainy train yard and asked me who exactly was going to haul his massive freight if Apex Heavy Logistics was suddenly shut down and locked out of the supply chain. I smiled, feeling the familiar roaring fire of my blue-collar grit rushing back into my exhausted muscles. I reached into the dry interior of my truck cabin and pulled out a fresh, pristine manila folder containing newly drafted, officially stamped incorporation papers. I handed the dry folder to Richard under his umbrella. I told him that as of 3 hours ago, Victor Harrison had legally established a brand new Shadow Logistics Corporation entirely under my name. It was called Vanguard Heavy Transport. Right now, it existed only on federal paper, but it was completely and entirely free of Bradley's toxic financial debt, his fraudulent shell companies, and Chloe's disastrous corporate mismanagement. I asked Richard to fund Vanguard Heavy Transport directly. I told him I desperately needed a massive immediate financial cash advance to secretly lease a brand new fleet of secondary transport rigs and quietly hire back every single loyal certified union mechanic that Bradley had carelessly fired over the past 6 months. I was going to rebuild the logistical operation in the shadows entirely outside of their corrupt purview, ready to catch the massive freight load the very second Apex collapsed. Richard Sterling did not hesitate for a single second. He recognized a man who was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. He pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from the inside pocket of his tailored coat, flipped to the back of the incorporation folder, and signed the multi-million-dollar funding authorization right there on the wet hood of my pickup truck. The rain drummed loudly against the metal as he handed the signed documents back to me. He looked at me through the pouring rain, his expression a mixture of deep respect and slight apprehension, and told me that I was a truly ruthless man. I tucked the priceless folder safely inside my jacket. I replied that I was not a ruthless corporate raider. I was a grandfather desperately protecting his family from a predator, and that made me far more dangerous than just ruthless. With Richard Sterling's massive financial advance officially secured and actively clearing into my new hidden corporate bank accounts, the tactical pieces were perfectly aligned on the board. I had the undeniable federal evidence of wire fraud and embezzlement safely locked away in a secure vault with Victor Harrison. I had the guaranteed financial and legal backing of the most powerful infrastructure developer in the entire state. I had a brand new legally protected shadow corporation ready to instantly absorb the massive logistical operations, ensure highway safety, and save the livelihoods of my most loyal mechanics. Bradley and Chloe were currently sitting in their sprawling, lavish suburban mansion, drinking expensive imported wine and arrogantly congratulating themselves on their brilliant, bloodless corporate coup. They firmly believed they had successfully stolen my life's work, drained my retirement savings, and ruined my grandchildren's future without a single consequence. They thought they were the absolute masters of the universe, financially untouchable, and permanently victorious. They had absolutely no idea that the very ground beneath their custom floors had already been completely hollowed out, and the foundation was completely rigged with legal dynamite. I climbed back into my cold, damp pickup truck, turned the key in the ignition, and listened to the steady, comforting, powerful rumble of the old engine. The agonizing, suffocating betrayal that had completely paralyzed me just 24 hours ago in that glass boardroom was entirely gone. It had been completely burned away and replaced by a cold, calculating, unstoppable determination. I was going to get my grandchildren back. I was going to take back the legacy I built with my own 2 hands. The trap was now fully set. The legal arsenal was gathered, and the explosive charges were perfectly wired. Now all I needed to do was wait for the most perfect, humiliating, and public moment to pull the rug completely out from under their feet. The sprawling suburban neighborhood where my daughter and her husband lived always felt completely artificial to me. I drove my worn, heavy-duty pickup truck through the winding streets lined with massive identical mansions and perfectly manicured green lawns. The houses looked like expensive movie sets designed to hide the miserable, empty lives of the people living inside them. I parked at the very end of their long, paved driveway. My old engine rumbled loudly before I cut the ignition, the harsh mechanical sound completely out of place in this quiet, affluent community. My heart felt incredibly heavy in my chest. Before I could execute the devastating corporate strike that Victor Harrison and Richard Sterling were currently preparing, I had one absolute, uncompromising priority. I had to secure the physical and emotional safety of my innocent grandchildren. I was not going to let Liam and Emma become collateral damage in the explosive legal war I was about to unleash upon their parents. I walked up the wide, concrete steps and rang the ornate front doorbell. I had spent the entire morning mentally preparing myself for this specific visit. I needed to act like a defeated, broken old man who was simply coming to say a pathetic final goodbye before fading into the background of their wealthy lives. I had to swallow every ounce of my blue-collar pride and wear a convincing mask of absolute submission. The heavy mahogany door was opened by a stressed-looking housekeeper who immediately recognized me. She offered a sympathetic nod and stepped aside to let me enter. The interior of the massive house was a chaotic mess of excessive corporate wealth and complete parental neglect. There were tall stacks of expensive catered food boxes, massive imported floral arrangements, and event planning binders scattered haphazardly across the pristine marble floors. Chloe was standing in the very center of the sprawling living room. She was wearing a designer silk robe and holding a gold-trimmed clipboard, barking aggressive, impatient orders into her cell phone. She was completely consumed by the logistics of her upcoming corporate celebration. She barely even looked at me when I walked into the room. She just waved her manicured hand dismissively, pointing blindly toward the back hallway. She loudly told me that the children were in the playroom, and that I needed to make my visit incredibly quick, because she was expecting the luxury party decorators to arrive at any moment. She did not ask how I was holding up. She did not show a single ounce of human remorse for stealing my logistics company or deliberately ruining my financial life. Her entire universe revolved strictly around her own manufactured social status and her desperate need to impress people who did not actually care about her. I walked down the long, freezing cold hallway toward the back of the estate. The playroom was an enormous vaulted space filled from wall to wall with expensive electronic toys and massive television screens. These expensive gadgets had clearly been purchased simply to keep the children artificially occupied and out of their parents' way. Liam and Emma were sitting together on the plush gray carpet. They were staring blankly at a digital tablet screen. Their small faces were pale and completely devoid of the bright, energetic joy they used to possess when they visited my home. They looked like silent, forgotten ghosts wandering through their own house. When they finally looked up and saw me standing quietly in the doorway, their eyes instantly widened with absolute shock and immediate relief. They dropped the electronic tablet onto the floor and ran across the room as fast as their little legs could carry them. They crashed into my knees with incredible force. I fell heavily to the floor, ignoring the sharp, grinding pain in my aging joints. I wrapped my thick, calloused arms tightly around their small, trembling bodies. I buried my scarred face in their soft hair, fighting back a massive, overwhelming wave of agonizing sorrow. They felt so incredibly fragile in my arms. "Grandpa is here," I whispered softly, holding them as tightly as I possibly could. "I missed you both so much." Emma, who is only 7 years old, looked up at me with heavy tears welling in her bright blue eyes. She gripped the collar of my worn canvas jacket with her tiny hands. She asked me with a broken voice why I had not come to visit them all week. She said her mother had explicitly told them that I was too busy enjoying my forced retirement to care about spending time with them anymore. The sheer calculated cruelty of that lie made the blood boil scalding hot in my veins. My own daughter was actively trying to poison my grandchildren against me to cover up her boardroom betrayal, but I forced my facial expression to remain perfectly calm and gentle. I absolutely could not let these innocent children see the raging, violent inferno burning deep inside my chest. I looked over at Liam, my 9-year-old grandson. He was a brilliant and highly observant boy. I could easily see the heavy toxic anxiety weighing down his small shoulders. He knew something was terribly wrong inside his house, even if he did not possess the vocabulary to fully understand the massive adult betrayal happening right in front of him. He quietly told me that his father, Bradley, was always screaming angrily on the telephone in his private office. He said his mother, Chloe, was constantly yelling at the hired staff and locking herself in the master bedroom. He looked at the floor and admitted that he and his sister felt completely invisible. I reached out and gently cupped their wet faces in my rough working hands. I knew this sprawling mansion was likely filled with hidden security cameras that Bradley had installed to monitor the staff. I could not risk Chloe or her husband overhearing my true intentions. So I leaned in very close, pulling them into a tight, private circle. I deliberately shifted our conversation into the secret foreign language we had painstakingly practiced together for years at my kitchen table. "Ich werde alles in Ordnung bringen," I whispered to them in perfect, fluent German, keeping my voice incredibly low and steady. "I am going to fix everything to fix." Liam and Emma's tearful eyes widened with immediate, profound recognition. The heavy, suffocating sadness on their small faces began to lift instantly. It was rapidly replaced by a sudden, powerful spark of genuine hope. We had spent hundreds of hours sitting together on Sunday afternoons, studying complex languages. They knew without a shadow of a doubt that when their grandfather spoke to them in German, it was an absolute, unbreakable blood promise. "Ihr müsst stark sein." I continued softly, looking deeply and intensely into their eyes. "You must be strong. Just for a little while longer. I am building a safe place for you, and very soon you will come live with me permanently. Do you understand what I am telling you?" They both nodded vigorously, throwing their small arms around my neck once again. I held them incredibly close, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of purpose crystallize in my tired soul. I was no longer just fighting to reclaim a commercial logistics company or recover a stolen retirement fund. I was fighting a holy war for their absolute salvation. I kissed their foreheads gently, stood up from the carpet, and walked out of the playroom. I did not look back at them. I could not afford to show any emotional weakness or hesitation now. I walked straight past Chloe, who was now furiously screaming at a premium catering vendor on her telephone, and exited the cold mansion. The exact moment the heavy front doors clicked shut behind me, the pathetic, defeated old man facade completely vanished into the thin air. I climbed into the cab of my pickup truck and immediately dialed the secure number of a private investigator I had retained 3 days ago. His name was Miller. He was a highly effective old associate of my corporate lawyer, Victor Harrison. Miller was an absolute ghost in the city, a man who specialized exclusively in tracking the dirty, hidden financial movements of wealthy corporate criminals who thought they were untouchable. I met Miller an hour later in the back corner booth of a quiet, unassuming roadside diner located on the desolate industrial edge of the city limits. He sat across from me in silence and slid a thick, heavy manila envelope across the sticky laminate table. I opened the unsealed flap and meticulously reviewed the contents while drinking a cup of bitter black coffee. It was the final devastating piece of the legal puzzle I desperately needed. Miller had executed his job flawlessly. The heavy envelope contained dozens of high-resolution photographs and heavily encrypted financial documents. There were clear, undeniable surveillance pictures of Bradley actively engaged in his blatant romantic affair with Jessica, the lead company accountant. They were clearly photographed entering and exiting expensive downtown hotel rooms, laughing and drinking premium alcohol paid for entirely by the company corporate credit card. But far more importantly, Miller had successfully secured the concrete paper trail, proving that Bradley's illegal Nevada shell companies were currently collapsing under massive catastrophic margin calls. The arrogant idiot had recklessly gambled away the stolen heavy equipment maintenance budgets and my grandchildren's entire educational trust funds on highly volatile failing technology stocks. Bradley was currently drowning in millions of dollars of inescapable debt, and he was desperately trying to drain the final drops of capital from Apex Heavy Logistics to save himself from total financial ruin. I did not waste a single second celebrating. I took the entire devastating dossier directly to Victor Harrison's towering downtown law office. Victor had already contacted a trusted, no-nonsense family court judge he had known personally for decades. We walked into the private judicial chambers and presented the judge with the absolute undeniable proof of Chloe's gross parental neglect. We showed the court her complete abdication of financial responsibility and Bradley's active, dangerous criminal behavior. The veteran judge was utterly appalled by the undeniable documentary evidence of the deliberately drained trust funds and the reckless corporate embezzlement that was directly endangering public highway safety. He recognized the immediate severe danger Liam and Emma were facing by remaining in that toxic household. Behind closed doors, operating entirely in secret without alerting Chloe or Bradley's legal team, the judge quietly signed a comprehensive set of emergency preemptive custody orders. The heavy legal documents granted me immediate full physical and legal custody of my grandchildren. The orders were designed to execute automatically the very second the federal fraud indictments were publicly handed down. The trap was now fully armed and legally binding. My family legacy was officially protected by the highest authority in the state. I drove back to my modest, debt-free home as the sun began to set. I felt a cold, dark, absolute satisfaction settling deep in my aging bones. The new Shadow Logistics Corporation was completely established and fully funded by Richard Sterling's massive cash advance. The certified union mechanics were quietly waiting in the wings for my direct signal to return to work. The federal authorities were currently reviewing the airtight embezzlement files Victor had provided them. And most importantly, my beloved grandchildren were legally secured and shielded from the upcoming blast radius. Bradley and Chloe were sitting in their expensive house assuming they had won the war. They had absolutely no idea that their entire manufactured universe was about to violently implode. As I was sitting on my back wooden porch, Watching the long evening shadows stretch quietly across the damp grass, my cell phone began to ring loudly in my pocket. I pulled it out, and the digital caller identification displayed my daughter's name. I let the phone ring 3 full times before I finally pressed the answer button, forcing my breathing to remain perfectly steady and calm. "Hello, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any readable emotion. "Dad," she replied. Her tone was dripping with arrogant, condescending pity. "I just wanted to call and make sure you managed to get home okay today. You looked so incredibly old and pathetic at the house this afternoon. I actually felt a little bit sorry for you having to see how well we are doing without you." I bit the inside of my cheek hard, forcing myself to remain totally silent and absorb her cruel, unnecessary insults. "Anyway," she continued, her voice brightening with a sickeningly fake enthusiasm, "Bradley and I were talking over dinner, and we decided we wanted to do something charitable for you. The Apex Corporate Gala is this coming Friday night. It is going to be the biggest, most luxurious event in the entire history of the commercial logistics industry. We are officially announcing the massive 10-year renewal of the Sterling infrastructure contract in front of all our wealthy friends and new investors. We decided to leave a special pity ticket for you at the front door under your name. We actually want you to come. We want you to stand in the back of the ballroom and see exactly how successful and wealthy this company is going to be, now that we have finally modernized it and pushed your outdated blue-collar mentality out of the way." She was literally inviting me to attend my own public humiliation. She desperately wanted to parade her stolen corporate wealth directly in front of my face and watch me suffer in the shadows while she drank expensive champagne on a lighted stage. Her blind arrogance was absolutely staggering. She was completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. I gripped the plastic casing of the phone incredibly tightly, staring out into the dark, silent yard. I let a long, heavy, uncomfortable moment of silence pass between us, allowing the tension to build over the cellular connection. "I truly appreciate the generous invitation, Chloe," I finally said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as winter ice. "I will absolutely be there. I promise you I would not miss this gala for the entire world." I ended the call immediately and placed the phone down on the wooden patio table. I looked up at the vast, empty night sky, feeling the familiar, roaring fire of my blue-collar grit hardening into an unstoppable weapon of absolute justice. Chloe wanted me to stand in the corner and watch her celebrate her false, treacherous victory. She had absolutely no idea that I was coming to the gala to tear the doors off the hinges and burn her stolen, corrupt empire straight to the ground. The 7 days leading up to the Friday evening Apex corporate celebration felt like the longest and most meticulously calculated week of my entire life. I did not sleep much during that time, usually managing only a few hours of fitful rest before my racing mind forced me awake. But the heavy, grinding exhaustion that usually settled deep into my aging bones from decades of hard blue-collar labor was completely gone. It was replaced by a sharp, calculating, and relentless energy that surged through my veins. I was no longer a grieving father mourning the loss of his family connection. Nor was I a betrayed founder, sulking in the shadows of an industry I helped build. I was a structural architect, laying down the reinforced steel foundation for the most spectacular and devastating corporate demolition this city had ever witnessed. On Monday morning, the sky was overcast, and threatening rain matching the cold resolve hardening in my chest. While my daughter Chloe and her arrogant husband Bradley were busy picking out extravagant floral arrangements and discussing lighting cues for their absurdly lavish party, I was sitting in a sterile, windowless interrogation room deep inside a federal law enforcement building downtown. My trusted corporate attorney Victor Harrison sat to my right, looking as calm and predatory as a veteran wolf smelling blood in the fresh snow. Across the heavy steel table sat two veteran federal investigators from the major white-collar crime division. They were serious men with tired eyes, accustomed to hearing lies from men in expensive suits. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn canvas work jacket and pulled out the small digital flash drive. I placed it directly in the center of the cold metal table. That tiny piece of plastic contained the complete, unedited financial ledgers and restricted server logs I had expertly extracted from the Fleet Yard computers in the dead of night. For 4 solid, agonizing hours, Victor and I walked the federal authorities through every single fraudulent transaction line by line. We painstakingly dissected the complex web of fake Nevada shell companies that Bradley had created out of thin air to hide his massive thievery. We exposed the highly illegal and dangerously falsified heavy machinery maintenance reports that deliberately put innocent highway drivers at catastrophic risk just to save a few dollars on the maintenance budget. The investigators were seasoned professionals who had seen every conceivable type of corporate greed, embezzlement, and financial manipulation imaginable. But even they were absolutely appalled by the sheer audacity and the reckless, life-threatening scale of my son-in-law's criminal behavior. They watched the digital money trail as it tracked the stolen heavy equipment budget directly into his personal, untouchable offshore bank accounts. They reviewed the undeniable documentary proof that he had systematically drained my innocent grandchildren's educational trust funds to cover his catastrophic stock market margin calls. I watched the expressions on the federal agents' faces shift from professional skepticism to cold, uncompromising anger. The lead agent, a man named Harris, who had spent 20 years hunting down corporate embezzlers, leaned across the table. He asked me directly if I understood the absolute severity of what I was handing over to the government. He firmly reminded me that once the federal wheels started turning, there was absolutely no stopping them. I would not be able to retract the digital evidence or protect my daughter from the catastrophic legal fallout of her gross negligence as the active chief executive officer of the logistics firm. I did not blink, and I did not hesitate for a single second. I told Agent Harris that my daughter had made her final choice the moment she slid that severance folder across the mahogany boardroom table and allowed a slick criminal to steal her own children's educational trusts. I signed the official federal whistleblower affidavits with a steady, unshakable hand, legally binding myself to the prosecution's upcoming criminal case. By the time we finally concluded the exhaustive, emotionally draining meeting, the lead federal investigator closed his legal notepad, looked me directly in the eyes, and assured me that official federal arrest warrants were currently being drafted by the district attorney. The federal trap was now officially armed, locked, and legally binding. Bradley was completely oblivious to the fact that the heavy steel doors of a federal penitentiary were already swinging open to swallow his future. With the criminal aspect of my counterattack securely in the hands of the federal authorities, I turned my undivided attention to protecting the actual heavy freight operations. Richard Sterling had already provided the massive financial cash advance required to rapidly establish my new shadow logistics corporation, which we proudly named Vanguard Heavy Transport. While Chloe was busy picking out designer dresses and tasting expensive catered appetizers, I was quietly leasing a brand new fleet of specialized top-tier heavy transport rigs. I operated entirely out of a small, unassuming rented warehouse on the dusty industrial edge of the county, far away from the prying eyes of the Apex corporate staff and Bradley's hired security teams. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday personally calling every loyal, hard-working, and certified union mechanic that Bradley had carelessly fired over the past 6 months in his desperate bid to cut operational costs. I offered every single one of them their old jobs back with better pay, guaranteed full benefits, and the deep respect they actually deserved. Every single man accepted my offer immediately, without a moment of hesitation. They trusted my word, they knew my 40-year reputation in the heavy freight industry, and they knew I would never compromise their physical safety or their livelihoods for a quick corporate profit. The emotional reunion in that dusty warehouse was truly overwhelming for an old man like me. Seeing those honest men smiling again, grabbing their heavy steel wrenches and getting our newly leased trucks perfectly calibrated felt incredible. Getting everything ready for the massive interstate bridge project felt like a true rebirth of my original dream. The familiar, comforting smell of fresh diesel fuel, heavy industrial grease, and honest sweat echoing in the new warehouse completely restored my tired soul. I was actively reclaiming my life's work directly from the toxic ashes of my daughter's blind betrayal. Vanguard Heavy Transport was now fully operational, fully staffed, and quietly waiting in the deep shadows, ready to seamlessly absorb the massive Sterling infrastructure contract, the very second that Apex Heavy Logistics inevitably collapsed under the crushing weight of its own corporate corruption. As I drove away from the warehouse on Wednesday night, the rain began to fall heavily, washing the industrial grime from my truck's windshield. I thought about my late wife, Sarah, as I navigated the slick, dark roads. She had always been the dedicated peacemaker, the gentle soul who believed unconditionally in the inherent goodness of our only daughter. If she were alive today to see what Chloe had unfortunately become, a superficial, greedy shell of a woman willing to let her own children's bright future be pawned off for a luxury mountain condo, it would have completely broken her heart. I was doing this for Sarah's memory just as much as I was doing this for Liam and Emma. The kids were completely safe, now legally protected by the emergency custody orders I had secured earlier in the week, oblivious to the fact that their grandfather was methodically dismantling their parents' corrupt empire piece by piece. I knew that the emotional fallout from this Friday would be spectacular and deeply traumatic for everyone involved. But a sick forest must sometimes burn entirely to the ground so that new healthy growth can finally take root in the fertile ashes. I pulled my truck into the quiet driveway of my modest, debt-free home and spent the rest of the night carefully ironing my only formal suit. It was the exact same dark suit I had worn to Sarah's funeral, a profoundly fitting garment for an evening that would mark the permanent death of Bradley's freedom and Chloe's fake corporate facade. While I was sweating in a drafty warehouse and working hand in hand with federal agents to legally secure my innocent grandchildren's future, Chloe and Bradley were living in a manufactured and highly unstable reality fueled by massive amounts of stolen capital. They were entirely intoxicated by their own arrogant illusions of grandeur, endless wealth, and untouchable corporate superiority. The private investigator I had hired continued to monitor their daily financial movements and personal activities, and his detailed daily reports were physically sickening to read. Chloe had transformed into a terrifying monster of absolute vanity and superficial greed. She was treating the upcoming Friday evening event not as a standard business gathering to thank investors, but as her personal royal coronation among the city's wealthy elite high society. She had rented out the most expensive, exclusive, and sprawling ballroom in the entire downtown commercial district. She demanded imported crystal chandeliers to be hung from the vaulted ceilings and ordered massive, incredibly expensive ice sculptures carved meticulously into the shape of our heavy transport trucks. She approved thousands of dollars worth of premium imported champagne, exotic seafood catering, and a live classical orchestra to entertain her superficial friends. She was charging every single exorbitant, unnecessary expense directly to the Apex company credit line. She was blindly spending massive amounts of corporate capital that the logistics firm simply did not possess, trying to buy the respect of people who would abandon her tomorrow. According to the exhaustive surveillance reports, Chloe spent Thursday afternoon at an exclusive high-end boutique downtown, throwing a massive screaming tantrum because her custom-tailored $10,000 imported silk evening gown needed a last-minute alteration. She verbally abused the hard-working seamstresses, acting exactly like the entitled, heartless aristocrat she falsely believed herself to be. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the luxury credit card she used to pay for the expensive rush alteration was tied to a corporate account that was currently being actively monitored by federal fraud investigators. Bradley was busy finalizing the preliminary purchase agreement for his new luxury yacht, signing the digital paperwork, while sitting comfortably in the eucalyptus steam room of his exclusive country club. He was spending imaginary money, completely unaware that his offshore bank accounts had already been secretly flagged and frozen by the federal authorities that very morning. Bradley strutted around, bragging loudly and obnoxiously to anyone who would listen about how he had successfully modernized the logistics company by aggressively pushing out the outdated blue-collar dead weight. He truly believed he was an unstoppable financial genius who had executed the perfect corporate coup, feeling completely untouchable and entirely superior to the working-class men who actually built his stolen wealth. Bradley was blindly assuming that Richard Sterling's massive multi-million-dollar monthly infrastructure check was absolutely guaranteed to arrive on time early Friday morning. He desperately needed that specific massive check to cover all his fraudulent Nevada debts, the ridiculous and ballooning gala expenses, and the catastrophic spiraling losses in his secret high-risk brokerage accounts. He had absolutely no idea that Richard Sterling was actively and secretly funding his total destruction behind closed doors. The final and most crucial piece of my silent counterattack required flawless execution and absolute theatrical precision. I could not allow them to simply fade away quietly into bankruptcy or hide behind their expensive corporate lawyers while innocent people suffered the terrible consequences of their endless greed. I personally met with Richard Sterling late on Thursday evening to finalize the exact timing of the catastrophic legal blow we were about to deliver. Richard was still burning with a deep, righteous, unyielding fury over Bradley's reckless and insulting attempt to compromise the highway safety protocols. We sat together in his secure executive office, reviewing the obscure key man clause that gave him the ironclad, undeniable legal right to immediately and permanently void the entire multi-million-dollar logistics contract. I outlined my precise, uncompromising instructions to Richard, ensuring that we hit them exactly when they felt the absolute most victorious. I make sure Richard's legal team sends the termination notice via certified courier to arrive precisely during the middle of the gala in front of everyone. The Friday evening of the Apex Corporate Gala finally arrived, bringing with it a freezing and biting wind that swept off the harbor and rattled the heavy street lamps across the city. I did not drive my worn pickup truck to the venue. I wanted to arrive completely invisible, blending seamlessly into the background of their opulent celebration before I tore it entirely apart. I took a standard city cab and asked the driver to drop me off 2 blocks away from the grand entrance of the downtown luxury hotel. I was wearing the only formal suit I owned. It was the exact same dark and conservative suit I had worn to my beloved wife Sarah's funeral so many years ago. It felt profoundly fitting for tonight. I was attending another funeral, but this time it was the permanent death of a corrupt empire built on my broken back and the stolen future of my innocent grandchildren. I walked through the towering glass doors of the hotel and handed my pity ticket to the security staff stationed at the entrance of the grand ballroom. The moment I stepped over the threshold and walked inside, the sheer and staggering scale of their financial recklessness hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The sprawling room was dripping in excessive and unearned wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant and blinding light over hundreds of guests dressed in custom tuxedos and imported silk gowns. In the very center of the room stood a towering champagne tower, overflowing with premium vintage alcohol that cost more per bottle than my certified union mechanics made in an entire week of grueling labor. But the absolute worst insult was placed directly near the main stage. There, catching the bright stage lights, were two massive ice sculptures carved exactly into the shape of the heavy transport rigs I had personally purchased to start this logistics company 9 years ago. They were literally freezing my blood and my sweat into a decorative centerpiece for their superficial friends. I stood in the shadows near the back wall, staring at the extravagant display, feeling the cold and righteous fury hardening every muscle in my aging body. Every single imported flower, every drop of expensive champagne, and every hour of the live classical orchestra playing softly in the corner was paid for entirely with stolen money. They were celebrating with the funds drained from my grandchildren's educational trusts and the dangerous cuts they had made to the highway safety maintenance budgets. I moved slowly along the perimeter of the ballroom, keeping my distance from the bright center lights, observing the crowd of wealthy investors and corporate socialites. That is when I saw my daughter. Chloe was standing near a massive floral arrangement, surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy investors and local politicians. She was wearing a breathtaking and custom-tailored designer gown that sparkled under the chandeliers, holding a crystal flute of champagne. She looked absolutely radiant, completely intoxicated by her own manufactured social status and the illusion of immense corporate power. I watched her laugh loudly at a joke someone made, flipping her hair over her shoulder, completely detached from the reality of the fraudulent crimes her husband was committing right under her nose. She suddenly spotted me standing in the shadows. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of genuine annoyance cross her perfectly made-up face, as if I were an ugly stain on a pristine white carpet. But she quickly recovered, pasting on a sickeningly sweet and condescending smile. She raised her voice just loud enough so that her entire circle of wealthy friends could hear her clearly over the classical music. She pointed her champagne flute directly at me and began to speak to the crowd, using me as a pathetic prop for her own vanity. She told them that I was the original founder of the company, but she used a tone dripping with pity and absolute disrespect. She proudly announced to the group of investors that the logistics industry was evolving rapidly into a modern corporate age, and that the older generation simply needed to step aside and make room for true visionary leadership. She actually laughed, a cold and empty sound, claiming that my blue-collar mentality and outdated methods were holding the company back from its true global potential. She told her wealthy friends that it took incredible courage for a young female chief executive officer to make the hard choice to push out the old dead weight, even if that dead weight was her own father, for the ultimate good of the corporate future. The investors nodded in agreement, raising their glasses to toast her bravery and her brilliant modern vision. I stood there listening to my own flesh and blood completely humiliate me in front of strangers, feeling a profound and agonizing sorrow mixed with a terrifying and unyielding rage. She was so entirely consumed by her own vanity that she had completely lost her soul. I did not react. I did not shout or defend my 40 years of pristine industry reputation. I simply maintained a cold and steady gaze, knowing that her entire false reality was minutes away from absolute destruction. I walked away from the crowd and approached the long marble bar situated on the far side of the massive ballroom. I ordered a simple glass of club soda with a slice of lemon. I did not want a single drop of alcohol dulling my senses tonight. I needed my mind to be as sharp and clear as a surgical blade. As the bartender handed me the cold glass, I felt a heavy and arrogant presence step up directly beside me. I did not even need to turn my head to know who it was. The overpowering stench of imported luxury cologne announced Bradley long before he spoke. He leaned his elbow casually against the marble bar, invading my personal space, looking incredibly smug in a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my pickup truck. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on the worn and frayed cuffs of my old funeral suit and the thick, calloused scars covering my working hands. He let out a low and mocking chuckle. "I am honestly surprised you actually showed up tonight, Thomas," he said, his voice dripping with condescension and unearned superiority. "I thought you would be sitting alone in your dark living room crying over your outdated safety manuals." I took a slow sip of my club soda, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead on the rows of expensive liquor bottles. I did not give him the satisfaction of looking at his face. This infuriated his massive ego. He leaned in closer, dropping the fake polite facade entirely, his voice hardening into a vicious and quiet threat. He told me that I was only invited as a joke, a pathetic visual reminder of what the company used to be before he stepped in and made it truly profitable. He stared at my worn hands and told me I did not belong in a room with real money. Then he explicitly threatened me. He stated that if I tried to talk to any of the investors, if I complained about the forced buyout clause, or if I did absolutely anything to embarrass him and Chloe on their most important night, he would personally signal the security guards to physically drag me out the back service doors and throw me into the wet alley like the garbage I was. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into his eyes. I saw the pure and unfiltered arrogance of a man who firmly believed he was completely untouchable. He truly believed he had successfully stolen my company, drained my grandchildren's trusts, and funded his lavish offshore life without leaving a single trace. I did not argue with him. I did not threaten him back or reveal a single detail of the massive federal fraud investigation currently surrounding his entire existence. I simply offered him a very cold and deeply unsettling smile. I told him he had absolutely nothing to worry about from me. I told him I was just an old and outdated man enjoying a glass of water, simply waiting patiently for the clock to strike. Bradley frowned, clearly confused and slightly unnerved by my absolute and unnatural calm. He scoffed, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and walked away to rejoin the wealthy elite, completely oblivious to the fact that the trap was already snapping shut around his ankles. I remained standing quietly at the edge of the bar, watching the large digital clock mounted discreetly near the kitchen doors. The seconds ticked away with agonizing slowness, each one building the incredible and electric tension inside my chest. The classical orchestra abruptly stopped playing, replaced by a loud and celebratory fanfare that echoed through the massive ballroom. The bright overhead chandeliers dimmed slightly, and a powerful spotlight illuminated the grand stage at the front of the room. The crowd of hundreds of wealthy investors, local politicians, and corporate socialites immediately grew quiet, turning their attention toward the microphone. Chloe walked up the steps to the stage, moving with the practiced and elegant grace of a woman who felt she owned the entire world. Bradley followed closely behind her, standing at her side, with his chest puffed out, holding an enormous and oversized bottle of premium vintage champagne. Chloe tapped the microphone, the sharp sound cutting through the silent room. She smiled radiantly at the audience, her eyes shining with absolute and unfiltered greed and pride. She thanked everyone for attending the most important night in the history of Apex Heavy Logistics. She spoke passionately about the future, about modernizing the freight industry, and about leaving behind the old restrictive blue-collar methods that had supposedly held the company back for so many years. She then raised her hand, signaling for absolute silence. She announced that she was incredibly proud and honored to officially reveal the immediate 10-year renewal of their largest and most lucrative commercial partnership, the massive infrastructure development contract with Richard Sterling. The crowd immediately erupted into polite and enthusiastic applause. Investors smiled greedily, already calculating their massive future profits based on this false information. Bradley stepped forward into the spotlight, positioning the massive bottle of champagne directly in front of the microphone, placing his thumbs firmly under the wire cage of the cork, preparing to pop the bottle and shower the front row in an explosive celebration of their stolen victory. The applause reached a crescendo. Chloe beamed with absolute triumph, believing she had officially secured her position as a wealthy and untouchable corporate queen. But just as Bradley's thumbs pushed upward against the heavy cork before the celebratory pop could even register in the silent room, a massive and deafening crash violently shattered the atmosphere. The heavy and ornate double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom did not just open. They were violently and forcefully pushed apart, slamming loudly against the interior walls. The echoing boom immediately silenced the applause, freezing Chloe and Bradley on the stage like terrified statues in the harsh glare of the spotlight. The entire room of wealthy guests turned around in unison, gasping in absolute shock as the shadows of several imposing figures stepped aggressively over the threshold and into the light. The heavy mahogany double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom did not simply open. They were violently and aggressively pushed apart, slamming with a deafening, echoing thud against the interior walls. The massive sound ripped through the opulent space, completely shattering the polite, enthusiastic applause that had been building for Chloe and her false victory. The live classical orchestra, which had been playing a soft and elegant symphony in the corner, stopped playing instantly. The musicians lowered their instruments in confusion. The sudden suffocating silence that fell over the hundreds of wealthy investors, local politicians, and corporate socialites was incredibly thick and heavy. On the brightly lit stage, Bradley froze completely. His perfectly manicured hands were still wrapped tightly around the thick neck of the oversized premium vintage champagne bottle. His smug, arrogant smile instantly melted into a look of profound, terrified confusion. Chloe stood right beside him, her hands frozen mid-clap, her eyes darting nervously toward the back of the room. Through the wide-open doors stepped Richard Sterling. He did not look like an esteemed guest arriving late to a luxurious corporate celebration. He looked like a veteran military general, stepping directly onto a hostile battlefield. He was flanked by 4 men in dark, conservative suits. They were his elite, ruthless legal team. Richard wore a charcoal gray suit and an expression of absolute unyielding fury that seemed to lower the temperature in the entire room. The bright crystal chandeliers above cast long, sharp shadows across his weathered face as he began to walk down the center aisle. He did not look left or right. He did not acknowledge the frantic murmurs of the wealthy guests who were quickly stepping aside to clear a path for him. His eyes were locked entirely on the stage. I remained standing in the dim, quiet shadows near the long marble bar. My heart beat with a slow, steady, and incredibly calm rhythm. The righteous anger that had kept me awake for an entire week was now perfectly contained, focused entirely on the spectacular demolition unfolding right in front of my eyes. I watched my daughter clutch the silk fabric of her expensive designer gown, trying desperately to maintain her composed high society facade. She forced a bright, completely artificial smile onto her face and leaned closely into the microphone stand. "Richard, What an absolutely incredible surprise, Chloe announced, her voice echoing nervously through the silent, tense ballroom. We were just about to celebrate the 10-year renewal of our commercial partnership. Please come join us up here on the stage. Richard Sterling did not say a single word in response to her fake pleasantries. He reached the front of the room and climbed the short wooden stairs to the stage with heavy, deliberate, and uncompromising steps. The floorboards creaked loudly under his imposing weight. He walked straight past Bradley, completely ignoring the nervously extended hand my son-in-law offered him. Richard walked directly up to the microphone where Chloe was standing. He looked her up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust, as if he were looking at something foul he had just stepped on. Then, with a swift, aggressive, and highly deliberate motion, Richard reached out and grabbed the thick black audio cable plugged into the base of her microphone. He ripped it out entirely. A harsh, deafening burst of static feedback shrieked violently through the massive ballroom speakers, causing several wealthy investors in the front row to flinch backward and cover their ears in pain. The illusion of the perfect, flawless corporate gala was completely dead. Richard turned his broad back on my daughter, dismissing her existence entirely. He faced the massive crowd of investors, politicians, and socialites. He did not need a microphone to be heard. His voice was naturally loud, commanding, and filled with decades of undeniable, hard-earned authority. There will be absolutely no celebration here tonight, Richard announced, his deep voice carrying effortlessly to the very back corners of the vaulted room. And there will definitely be no renewal of any commercial contract between Sterling Infrastructure Development and Apex Heavy Logistics. The entire ballroom immediately erupted into a chaotic, panicked symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. Men in expensive custom tuxedos nervously adjusted their ties and looked at each other in sheer confusion. Women in imported silk gowns covered their mouths in absolute disbelief. Chloe took a stumbling step backward, her face draining of all color, until she looked like a pale ghost standing under the bright stage lights. "Richard, please, you must be mistaken," Chloe stammered, her voice shaking violently as her perfect reality began to crack. "I do not understand what is happening. We have already drafted the preliminary agreements. We are corporate partners." Richard turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder, with eyes as cold as winter ice. "We are absolutely not partners, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with pure contempt. "True commercial partners do not deliberately sabotage heavy freight machinery and actively risk the lives of innocent families on the highway just to pad their own offshore bank accounts. Partners do not systematically falsify federal safety maintenance logs to steal capital from the operating budget." He turned his full, furious attention back to the crowd of wealthy attendees. He pointed a firm, accusatory finger directly at the center of the room, addressing the men who had blindly given Chloe their money. "Every single person in this building who has invested capital in this logistics firm has been brutally and maliciously lied to. The executive board standing on this stage right now is actively committing massive federal wire fraud, gross corporate embezzlement, and criminal negligence." The whispers in the crowd escalated into loud, panicked, and aggressive conversations. Wealthy investors began pulling out their cell phones in a frantic rush, desperately typing messages to their financial brokers to pull their funding. Richard was not finished. He stepped even closer to the edge of the stage, towering intimidatingly over the front row of guests. They maliciously fired the only man who possessed the actual integrity and knowledge required to run this heavy freight fleet properly. Richard continued, his voice booming with righteous indignation. They orchestrated a boardroom ambush to push out Thomas Sullivan so they could freely drain the company accounts and fund their highly illegal, fraudulent shell corporations hidden in Nevada. As of this exact moment, I am officially and legally exercising the key man clause hidden deep within my original master contract. I am pulling every single project, every single dollar, and every single piece of freight from Apex Heavy Logistics. This corrupt company is officially dead. Richard signaled sharply to his elite legal team. One of the men in a dark suit immediately stepped forward and slapped a massive, thick stack of official termination documents directly onto the pristine surface of the champagne table. The heavy legal papers slid rapidly across the polished mahogany wood and violently knocked over several crystal glasses. The fragile glass shattered loudly on the floor, producing a perfectly fitting sound for the absolute and total destruction of Chloe's fake empire. Richard did not bother to look at her again. He turned around, walked heavily down the stage stairs, and marched straight out the back doors, leaving a massive wake of total devastation and financial ruin behind him. The immediate aftermath of Richard Sterling's exit was completely catastrophic. The grand ballroom rapidly transformed into a terrifying scene of absolute corporate panic. The wealthy socialites who had just been drinking expensive champagne and toasting to Chloe's supposed brilliance were now actively running toward the exit doors. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a massive federal fraud scandal. The investors who had previously smiled and nodded at her arrogant speech were now shouting angrily at each other, realizing their invested money was completely gone. The classical musicians quietly packed up their string instruments and fled the stage in a hurry. The lavish, incredibly expensive ice sculptures carved in the shape of my transport trucks began to melt rapidly under the hot stage lights, dripping cold water onto the expensive imported carpets. Chloe stood completely frozen in the dead center of the stage. Her perfect, meticulously crafted world was violently imploding right in front of her terrified eyes. She dropped her crystal champagne flute from her trembling hand. It shattered into a dozen pieces against the wooden floorboards. She began to hyperventilate loudly. Her chest heaved rapidly as she finally realized the catastrophic legal and financial ruin that had just been publicly dropped onto her shoulders. She spun around desperately, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror, frantically searching for the one person she believed would save her. She looked desperately for her husband. She looked for the man who had promised her endless wealth, high society status, and a life of untouchable luxury. Bradley. Chloe cried out, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. Bradley, please, you have to fix this right now. Tell them it is a massive mistake. Tell them the corporate accounts are perfectly fine. But Bradley Hayes was not standing proudly beside her. He was not stepping forward to bravely defend his wife or protect the logistics company he had maliciously stolen. I watched him closely from my isolated spot in the dark shadows. The arrogant, slick, condescending man who had mocked my worn, calloused hands just 30 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, pathetic, cornered rat. He had dropped the oversized bottle of premium champagne directly onto the floor. It was currently rolling away, spilling expensive vintage alcohol all over the wooden stage. Bradley was already backing away slowly, his eyes darting frantically around the chaotic room, desperately looking for an immediate escape route. He did not answer his pleading wife. He did not even bother to look at her crying face. He knew the federal authorities were likely already building an airtight case based on Richard's highly public accusations. He knew his hidden offshore accounts and the fraudulent Nevada shell companies were completely exposed to the light. His only remaining instinct was pure, selfish, cowardly survival. He turned his back on Chloe and began to rush quickly toward the side emergency exit of the ballroom, trying desperately to blend in with the panicked crowd of fleeing guests. He was entirely willing to leave her standing alone in the burning building while he saved his own skin. I knew it was finally my time to act. I stepped out of the protective, quiet shadows of the marble bar. I walked slowly, deliberately, and with absolute purpose through the chaotic, shouting crowd. Panicked people bumped into my shoulders as they rushed blindly toward the coat check, but I did not break my steady stride. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the brightly lit stage. The righteous, unyielding anger burning deep in my chest gave me a physical strength I had not felt in many years. I climbed the wooden stairs. My heavy, worn blue collar shoes made a solid, echoing, unforgiving sound against the floorboards. Chloe was kneeling on the stage now, weeping miserably into her manicured hands, completely abandoned by her wealthy country club friends and utterly betrayed by her cowardly husband. I stood directly over her. I looked down at the woman who had coldly fired me, deeply humiliated me, and blindly handed her own children's bright future over to a ruthless parasite. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I only felt the cold, hard, heavy weight of absolute justice. "Chloe," I said. My voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of any paternal comfort. She gasped violently and looked up at me. Her highly expensive designer makeup was entirely ruined, running down her pale face in dark, ugly streaks. "Dad," she sobbed miserably, reaching a trembling hand toward my pant leg. "Dad, please, you have to help me. Richard has gone completely crazy. He is ruining absolutely everything we built. Bradley will explain the finances to everyone. We just need to sit down and fix the contract." I stepped back firmly, completely refusing to let her touch me. I reached inside the inner pocket of my old, dark funeral suit. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope containing the meticulously printed financial dossiers. These were the exact same undeniable documents Victor Harrison and I had securely handed over to the federal investigators earlier that week. I tossed the heavy envelope onto the stage floor, letting it land with a loud smack right in front of her trembling knees. "Bradley is not going to explain anything to anyone, Chloe," I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as winter ice. "Bradley is currently trying to sneak out the back door like a coward, because he knows exactly what is waiting inside that envelope. He is abandoning you to take the fall." Chloe looked down at the brown envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Her hands shook violently as she reached out and opened the paper flap. She slowly pulled out the thick stacks of printed paper. I stood tall over her and aggressively forced her to confront the absolute undeniable truth she had willfully ignored for years. "Look closely at it, Chloe," I commanded, my voice carrying the heavy weight of decades of hard work and sacrifice. "Look at the fraudulent digital invoices from the fake Nevada shell companies. Look at the highly illegal, heavily falsified maintenance logs that your husband forged to deliberately starve our heavy transport trucks of basic life-saving safety repairs. Look at the undeniable proof that he has been stealing millions of dollars to fund a luxury condo in Aspen and an expensive yacht, all while conducting a blatant affair with your lead accountant, Jessica." She frantically flipped through the pages, her eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated horror as the undeniable proof of her husband's criminal enterprise and profound infidelity stared right back at her. But I was not finished delivering the truth. I reached down into the envelope and pulled out the final, most devastating stack of bank statements, the ones that had completely broken my heart while sitting in my empty kitchen. I dropped them directly into her lap. "Now look at the personal accounts, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, deeply angry whisper. "Look at the educational trust funds. Look at the accounts I painstakingly built with my own sweat for Liam and Emma, so they could have a flawless future, including the funds meant to ensure they mastered English, Italian, German, and Mandarin. Look at your own digital signature repeatedly authorizing the total liquidation of your children's future just to cover your husband's massive, reckless gambling debts on the stock market." Chloe stared blindly at the zero balances printed clearly on the trust fund statements. A loud, agonizing, deeply broken wail tore violently from her throat. It was the devastating sound of a woman whose entire manufactured universe had just completely collapsed in on itself. She dropped the financial papers and grabbed her head with both hands, sobbing uncontrollably onto the stage floor. She finally realized the massive, catastrophic scale of her own blind vanity. She had been so completely obsessed with her country club status, so deeply intoxicated by the fake illusion of massive corporate wealth, that she had completely neglected her own children and blindly handed a manipulative criminal the very knife he used to gut her family. You sat in a glass boardroom and fired me because you arrogantly thought I was too blue-collar and outdated for your pristine corporate image, I told her, my voice echoing powerfully over her loud, pathetic sobs. You let a slick man in a tailored suit systematically steal your company, steal your house, and permanently steal the brilliant future I bled to build for my innocent grandchildren. You built a massive house of absolute lies on my back, Chloe, and your own insatiable arrogance completely blinded you while he burned it straight to the ground. I stood resolute and immovable on the brightly lit stage, looking past her weeping, broken figure. I looked calmly toward the side exit doors, watching as Bradley tried desperately and frantically to push his way through the fleeing crowd, completely unaware that his path out of the building was already securely blocked by federal authorities. The grand ballroom was rapidly descending into a state of absolute unmitigated chaos, transforming from a pristine sanctuary of corporate wealth into a swirling, panicked stampede of shattered illusions. The wealthy investors, local politicians, and high society socialites who had just been toasting to a fraudulent future with vintage champagne were now frantically pushing against one another. They were desperate to escape the blast radius of the massive federal scandal that Richard Sterling had just detonated right in front of their terrified eyes. And caught dead in the middle of that frantic, terrified crowd was Bradley Hayes. I watched him intently from my quiet, elevated vantage point on the brightly lit stage. The arrogant, slick son-in-law who had ruthlessly mocked my calloused hands and threatened to have security throw me into the wet alley was completely stripped of his unearned superiority. He was no longer a smug, untouchable chief executive officer holding court among the city's elite. He was a terrified, cornered animal, desperately searching for a dark hole to crawl into. He abandoned his weeping wife without a single second of hesitation or remorse. He pushed roughly past the fleeing guests, stepping heavily on imported silk gowns and knocking over delicate crystal centerpieces, his wide, panicked eyes locked entirely on the heavy wooden emergency exit doors located at the far back corner of the opulent room. He firmly believed he could simply slip out into the freezing night air, jump behind the wheel of his luxury sports car, and disappear to his hidden offshore accounts before the authorities could fully untangle the massive web of his corporate embezzlement. He reached the heavy brass handles of the emergency doors and shoved them open with all the frantic strength his panicked body could muster, fully expecting to feel the biting, liberating wind of the dark city street. Instead, he slammed violently into a solid, unyielding wall of dark tactical uniforms. The heavy doors swung wide to reveal Victor Harrison, my brilliant and utterly ruthless corporate lawyer, standing perfectly calm in the service hallway. Victor was not alone in the shadows. Flanking him on both sides were half a dozen federal marshals and local police officers, their silver badges and heavy utility belts gleaming sharply under the dim, flickering emergency lights. Bradley stumbled backward, his breath catching audibly in his throat. His face instantly drained of all its healthy country club color until it matched the stark white of his bespoke tuxedo shirt. He tried to quickly pivot on his expensive leather shoes and run toward the kitchen corridor, but two heavy-set federal marshals stepped forward with lightning speed, completely and aggressively blocking his only route of escape. Victor Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and looked at my son-in-law with a cold, predatory smile that sent a visible shiver down Bradley's spine. Victor held up a thick, officially stamped stack of federal warrants. The lead marshal did not waste time with polite conversation. He stepped aggressively into the ballroom, grabbed Bradley by the shoulder of his immaculate jacket, and spun him around with an absolute uncompromising physical force that Bradley had never experienced in his sheltered, privileged life. Bradley stammered frantically, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate panic. He demanded that they unhand him immediately, screaming at the top of his lungs that he was a wealthy corporate executive, a respected member of the community, and that they were making a catastrophic, career-ending legal mistake. But the federal marshals did not care about his extensive stock portfolio, his imported clothes, or his empty threats. They slammed him face first against the cold, polished marble wall of the ballroom with a heavy thud that knocked the wind right out of his lungs. The harsh, heavy, metallic clicking of thick steel handcuffs snapping violently shut around his perfectly manicured wrists echoed loudly over the shouting, chaotic crowd. The physical, undeniable reality of those cold steel cuffs biting into his skin finally broke his arrogant, carefully constructed facade. The illusion of untouchable power shattered into a million pieces. Bradley began to beg, sobbing pathetically, and pleading for mercy in front of the very same wealthy investors he had spent years trying to manipulate and impress. The high society elite stopped fleeing for just a brief, horrifying moment, standing frozen in absolute shock as they watched the supposed visionary genius of Apex Heavy Logistics reduced to a crying, humiliated, broken criminal being dragged out the back door by federal authorities. All his stolen millions, his Nevada shell companies, and his grandiose plans for a luxury yacht could not save him from the heavy, crushing weight of federal justice. The swift and absolute hammer of the law did not stop with my cowardly son-in-law. Near the overflowing, extravagant champagne tower in the center of the devastated room, Jessica, the lead corporate accountant and Bradley's secret partner in crime, was frantically trying to blend into the chaotic shadows. She had hastily kicked off her expensive high heels and was attempting to quietly slip toward the coat check, clutching her designer purse tightly against her chest, hoping to escape unnoticed in the confusion. But Victor Harrison and the federal investigators had already spent days meticulously reviewing the airtight digital ledgers, the falsified safety maintenance logs, and the fraudulent offshore wire transfers I had expertly extracted from the Fleet Yard servers. They knew exactly who she was, and they knew exactly how complicit she was in draining the heavy machinery budgets and liquidating my innocent grandchildren's educational trust funds. A stern female police officer intercepted Jessica halfway across the ruined dance floor. Jessica tried to feign ignorance, playing the role of an innocent, confused gala guest, but the officer firmly grabbed her arm completely, ignoring her theatrical protests, and recited her Miranda rights loud and clear for everyone in the vicinity to hear. The cruel, calculating mistress who had laughed so freely at my destruction in the dark, isolated dispatch office just a week ago, was now weeping uncontrollably. Her head bowed in absolute shame as the cold steel handcuffs were locked securely around her own wrists. I slowly turned my attention back to the wooden stage beneath my feet. Chloe was still kneeling on the hard floorboards, completely surrounded by the scattered, undeniable financial dossiers that proved her husband's absolute monstrous betrayal. She had just watched the man she foolishly loved, the man she had blindly handed unchecked financial control over to get dragged out of the building in heavy federal chains. She had just seen her lead accountant, the woman she trusted to manage her corporate wealth, arrested for massive wire fraud and embezzlement. The lavish, incredibly expensive corporate celebration she had proudly organized, charging imported ice sculptures and classical orchestras to the company credit line, had violently transformed into a highly public, catastrophic crime scene. Her perfectly crafted high society universe, built entirely on a foundation of stolen money and profound vanity, was completely and utterly dead. Chloe slowly looked up at me from the floor. Her expensive, meticulously applied designer makeup was entirely ruined, running down her pale, terrified face in dark, ugly, jagged streaks. Her custom-tailored imported silk evening gown was soaked in spilled champagne and wrinkled beyond any hope of repair, making her look like a broken doll cast aside in the aftermath of a terrible storm. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow, desperate breaths as the crushing, inescapable weight of her own gross negligence and monumental stupidity finally landed squarely on her shoulders. She reached out with trembling, frantic hands and grabbed the rough fabric of my worn, dark funeral suit. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice cracking with a raw, unfiltered agony that echoed painfully through the rapidly emptying, cavernous ballroom. "Dad, please, you have to do something. You have to tell them to stop. You have to help me." "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know what he was doing with the money. You have to fix this." She called me Dad for the very first time in months. For the last 9 long years, I had bent over backwards, destroyed my aging physical health, and eagerly drained my entire retirement savings just to hear her call me that, with genuine pride and affection. But right now, hearing that sacred word slip from her trembling, deceitful lips felt completely hollow and deeply offensive. It was not a word spoken out of love, respect, or true familial bond. It was a desperate, calculated, pathetic plea for survival from a woman who had willingly and coldly cut my throat in a sterile glass boardroom just to secure her own superficial wealth. She sobbed miserably, her tears soaking into the knees of my trousers, begging me to tell the federal agents that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She pleaded with me to use my old industry influence and my relationship with Richard Sterling to save her from the horrific, life-altering legal nightmare that was about to consume her entire existence. She cried frantically that she was completely innocent, that she was just a naive victim of Bradley's cruel manipulation, and that I needed to protect her from the police because she was my only daughter. I did not step back. I did not immediately pull my leg away from her trembling, desperate grasp. I stood incredibly tall and completely immovable under the bright, glaring stage spotlights. I looked down at her, not with the warm, unconditional, protective love of a forgiving father, and certainly not with the explosive, screaming out-of-control rage of a betrayed business partner. I looked at her with steady, resolute, and absolutely unforgiving eyes. The roaring fire of my blue-collar grit, the righteous anger that had fueled my silent counterattack for the past week, had permanently hardened into a cold, unbreakable, absolute steel. "You built a massive, towering house of lies entirely on my broken back, Chloe," I said. My voice was low, incredibly calm, and heavy with the devastating, undeniable truth. It was a tone that carried the weight of 40 years of hard labor and 9 years of unappreciated sacrifice. You sat across from me in that sterile corporate boardroom, and you fired me because you arrogantly thought my honest, hard-working hands were too dirty and too blue-collar for your pristine, modernized public image. You let a slick, manipulative, parasitic criminal systematically steal the logistics company I bled to build from the dirt up. You deliberately and knowingly signed authorizations that starved the heavy freight trucks of their critical, life-saving safety repairs, actively risking the lives of innocent families on the highway, just so you could buy expensive designer dresses and host lavish country club galas. She shook her head violently from side to side, crying harder and louder, desperately trying to deny the ugly, terrifying reality of her own deeply selfish actions. She tried to interrupt me with more pathetic excuses, but I refused to let her hide behind her fake, convenient ignorance for a single second longer. And worst of all, I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, deeply angry, unyielding whisper that cut straight through her miserable, echoing sobs. "You blindly and carelessly handed over your own innocent children's bright future. You signed away Liam and Emma's educational trusts, the money I worked my entire life to save, just so you could drink vintage champagne and pretend to be a self-made millionaire with people who do not actually care if you live or die. You were not a helpless, naive victim, Chloe. You were completely and utterly blinded by your own insatiable greed and your profound arrogance, and now the bill has finally come due. You reap exactly what you sow. The exact moment those final unforgiving words left my mouth, a loud, authoritative, booming voice echoed across the devastated grand ballroom. The lead federal investigator stood near the shattered main entrance doors, holding a heavy-duty police megaphone. He officially and loudly announced to the remaining hotel staff, the local authorities, and the few lingering shell-shocked guests that as of this exact minute, by direct order of a federal judge, every single corporate bank account, physical asset, and commercial property tied to Apex Heavy Logistics was immediately and indefinitely frozen. The company credit lines were entirely deactivated. The massive transport fleet sitting in the industrial yards was legally grounded and impounded. The corrupt, fraudulent corporate empire they had built on my sweat and my stolen money was officially bankrupt and entirely dead. The remaining high society gala attendees, the wealthy, superficial friends Chloe had so desperately tried to impress and court for years, did not offer her a single word of comfort. They did not rush to the wooden stage to help her up or offer her legal counsel. They looked at her kneeling pathetically in the spilled champagne and scattered financial documents with expressions of pure, unfiltered disgust and complete social rejection. They turned their backs on her in absolute unison and practically ran out the double doors, fleeing the toxic, radioactive fallout of her ruined life as if she were a highly contagious disease. In their cutthroat world of wealth and status, getting caught committing federal fraud was the ultimate unforgivable sin. I looked down at my daughter for one last, fleeting moment. She was completely and utterly alone, now permanently stripped of her fake corporate wealth, her precious country club status, and her unearned executive title. The lavish, incredibly expensive ice sculptures carved meticulously into the shape of my transport trucks were melting rapidly in the center of the dark room, dripping cold water onto the expensive imported carpets, serving as a perfect, tragic, and poetic symbol of her entirely dissolved illusions. I did not offer her my calloused hand. I did not offer her a false, comforting promise of future forgiveness or financial rescue. I turned my back on the pathetic wreckage of her life, walked steadily and proudly down the wooden stairs of the stage, and walked out of the grand ballroom with my head held high, stepping out into the cool, refreshing night air, fully ready to return to the only thing that truly mattered: my innocent grandchildren and the honest, hard-working legacy I was finally taking back. The morning after the catastrophic corporate gala brought a profound and entirely unfamiliar silence to my life. For an entire week, I had been running on pure adrenaline and righteous fury, orchestrating the absolute destruction of my arrogant son-in-law and the corrupt empire my daughter had allowed him to build. But as the sun rose over the city that Saturday morning, illuminating the quiet suburban streets and the fresh dew on the grass, I finally felt the heavy, suffocating weight lift completely from my aging shoulders. The trap had been sprung with absolute, flawless precision, and the federal authorities were now in total, uncompromising control of the massive wreckage Bradley and Chloe had left behind in that opulent ballroom. I sat alone at my scratched wooden kitchen table, drinking a hot cup of bitter black coffee, feeling a deep, permanent sense of peace settling into my tired bones. I did not have to hide in the dark, freezing shadows of the industrial fleet yard anymore. I did not have to pretend to be a defeated, broken old man who had simply accepted his unjust exile. I was Thomas Sullivan. I had successfully defended my family legacy, my life's work, and my innocent grandchildren against the very people who had maliciously tried to bury me alive. The legal aftermath of that explosive Friday night was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. The federal investigators, armed with the undeniable digital ledgers, the highly illegal falsified safety maintenance logs, and the offshore banking routing numbers I had extracted from the company's servers, moved with a terrifying efficiency. They did not give Bradley a single moment to breathe, to contact his expensive golf buddies, or to formulate a fake corporate defense. He was immediately held without bail as a severe flight risk, because the authorities knew all about his hidden offshore accounts and his desperate, cowardly plans to flee to a luxury condominium in Aspen while leaving his wife to take the fall. Watching the criminal trial unfold over the next few months was like watching a masterclass in absolute unyielding justice. The arrogant, slick country club man who had ruthlessly mocked my calloused working hands and threatened to have security throw me into a wet alley was completely unrecognizable in the sterile federal courtroom. He wore a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His custom-tailored navy blue suits, his expensive silk ties, and his flashy gold watches were entirely gone, seized by the government to pay back the millions of dollars he had blatantly stolen from the company and the investors. Victor Harrison, my brilliant and ruthless corporate lawyer, sat right beside me in the wooden gallery every single day of the trial. We watched quietly as the federal prosecutor systematically dismantled Bradley's entire fake existence piece by piece. They displayed the fraudulent Nevada shell company invoices on massive digital screens for the horrified jury to see. They played the secret audio recordings I had captured of him and his mistress Jessica, laughing maliciously about starving our heavy transport trucks of critical life-saving repairs. But the final devastating blow, the piece of evidence that completely sealed his miserable fate, came when they presented the official bank statements, showing how he had deliberately and cruelly drained my innocent grandchildren's educational trust funds to cover his catastrophic stock market gambling debts. The jury did not even need a full afternoon to deliberate the overwhelming mountain of evidence. They returned a swift, unanimous guilty verdict on all charges of massive federal wire fraud, gross corporate embezzlement, and criminal malfeasance. The federal judge, a stern, uncompromising man who actively despised white-collar criminals who risked public highway safety for personal profit, showed absolutely no mercy during the sentencing phase. Bradley was sentenced to 15 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. As the heavy-set federal marshals placed the thick steel handcuffs on his wrists to lead him away to his small concrete cell, he looked back at me from across the crowded courtroom. He was weeping openly, sobbing aloud, like a terrified, helpless child begging for a forgiveness he did not deserve. I did not smile, and I did not look away. I simply stared right back at him with cold, unyielding eyes, letting him know that he was finally reaping exactly what he had so maliciously sown. Chloe's inevitable downfall was equally devastating, but in a much more pathetic and socially humiliating way. She had foolishly believed that her dramatic tears and her desperate courtroom claims of total ignorance would somehow save her from the catastrophic legal and financial fallout. But the justice system does not care about high society status, designer silk gowns, or exclusive country club memberships. As the active chief executive officer of Apex Heavy Logistics, she was held completely and legally responsible for the gross negligence and the massive financial fraud occurring directly under her nose. Because she had blindly and willingly signed every single fraudulent financial authorization and every single catastrophic trust fund withdrawal just so she could maintain her fake wealthy lifestyle. The courts showed her zero sympathy. The massive, sprawling suburban mansion with the perfectly manicured lawns was immediately seized and auctioned off by the bank to cover the insurmountable corporate debts she had carelessly accumulated. Her imported luxury sports cars were towed away in the middle of the night. Her exclusive country club membership was publicly and permanently revoked, and her superficial wealthy friends, the very people she had tried so desperately to impress, completely abandoned her, treating her like a highly contagious disease. She narrowly avoided serving federal prison time by fully cooperating with the authorities and testifying against her husband, but the financial and social penalties completely ruined her manufactured universe. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and a mountain of legal fines. The arrogant woman who had stood on a brightly lit stage just months prior, condescendingly telling a ballroom full of wealthy investors that my blue-collar mentality was outdated and embarrassing, was now forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working class she so deeply despised. In order to survive and pay off her massive court-ordered legal restitutions, Chloe had to take a minimum wage job working the cash register at a local discount retail clothing store. Every single day she has to stand on her aching feet for 8 long, grueling hours, folding cheap shirts, sweeping floors, and dealing with rude, demanding customers for absolute pennies. She lost her fake corporate empire. She lost her social standing, and she lost her soul. But worst of all, she completely and permanently lost the right to be called a mother. Because of Chloe's undeniable complicity in the absolute financial ruin of her own children and her demonstrated gross psychological instability, the family court proceedings were incredibly brief and decisive. The veteran family court judge reviewed the extensive files Victor Harrison and the private investigator had prepared, detailing the absolute parental neglect Liam and Emma had suffered while their mother was busy organizing lavish corporate galas and buying expensive designer jewelry. The court officially and permanently stripped Chloe of all her parental and visitation rights, declaring her an entirely unfit guardian. They granted me permanent full physical and legal custody of my 2 beautiful, precious grandchildren. The day I brought Liam and Emma home to my modest, debt-free house was the single greatest, most profound victory of my entire life. When they walked through my front door carrying their small, packed suitcases, the heavy, toxic anxiety that had been crushing their little shoulders for the past year instantly evaporated. They ran directly into my arms, and I held them so tightly against my chest, promising them with tears in my eyes that they would never have to feel invisible, neglected, or afraid ever again. Ever. With the corrupt, toxic rot of Apex Heavy Logistics completely eradicated. Vanguard Heavy Transport, my brand new Shadow Logistics Corporation, stepped seamlessly and powerfully into the light. Richard Sterling was entirely true to his word, immediately transferring every single multi-million-dollar infrastructure contract directly to my new company. We happily rehired every single loyal, hard-working, certified union mechanic that Bradley had carelessly and maliciously fired. We purchased a brand new state-of-the-art fleet of top-tier heavy transport rigs, and we immediately restored the rigorous, unyielding safety protocols that had always been the absolute cornerstone of my professional reputation. Vanguard became massively successful almost overnight, generating incredible sustainable profits built on a solid foundation of honest sweat, absolute integrity, and mutual blue-collar respect. I spend my mornings walking the yard again, smelling the familiar, comforting scent of diesel fuel and hot asphalt, knowing that every single rig leaving my property is perfectly maintained and entirely safe for the public highways. The mechanics wave to me with genuine smiles, and the drivers know that their lives are valued above any corporate profit margin. This is how a real American business is supposed to be run, and I am incredibly proud to be back at the helm. The very first thing I did with those massive new corporate profits was completely and entirely restore the educational trust funds that Bradley had stolen from my grandchildren. I replaced every single missing dollar with added interest, ensuring beyond a shadow of a doubt that Liam and Emma would have the absolute flawless academic future I had always dreamed of for them. The dark, suffocating shadows of their past life in that cold, sprawling mansion slowly faded away, replaced by the bright warmth and the genuine, unconditional love of our new daily routine. My house is full of vibrant, joyful, energetic life once again. Every single morning, the three of us sit together around my scratched wooden kitchen table, eating warm scrambled eggs and toast before the yellow school bus arrives. I listen with absolute immense pride as my grandchildren switch effortlessly between speaking perfect English, beautiful Italian, and sharp, fluent German. They are so incredibly brilliant, and their young minds are healing and expanding every single day. And yes, we have officially started our intensive Mandarin language lessons. I bought them new colorful picture books, advanced audio courses, and interactive flashcards, and we spend our quiet Sunday afternoons practicing the complex tones and pronunciations together. I constantly remind them that Mandarin is the language of the future, and they must be fully prepared to step onto the global stage with absolute confidence and grace. We study the characters written on the whiteboard I installed in the living room, tracing the ancient symbols with dry erase markers while eating fresh-baked cookies. They laugh out loud when I stumble and mispronounce a difficult word, and that pure, sweet, innocent sound echoing through my kitchen is the absolute greatest reward I could ever possibly ask for. Sometimes when the sun begins to set, casting long, peaceful purple shadows across my green lawn, I sit quietly on the wooden steps of my back porch. I drink a cold glass of sweet iced tea, and I watch Liam and Emma playing safely in the yard, chasing each other and laughing freely under the wide open evening sky. I think deeply about the incredible agonizing journey we have survived over the past year. I think about the terrible sharp pain of betrayal, the sterile freezing glass boardroom, the dark dusty dispatch office, and the freezing rain in the abandoned train yard where I plotted my counterattack. I realize now, with absolute clarity, that evil does not always hide in the dark, forgotten alleys of the city. Sometimes the most dangerous, insidious evil wears a custom-tailored suit, a shiny gold watch, and a smug, friendly smile. It drives expensive, imported luxury cars and demands respect it never truly earned. Sometimes it sits right at your own dinner table, manipulating your unconditional love and weaponizing your deepest trust to serve its own selfish agenda. But the absolute, undeniable truth of this universe is that you can never truly outrun karma. The foundation of a life built entirely on lies, selfish greed, and the deliberate suffering of innocent people will always eventually collapse violently under its own rotten weight. The good guys, the men and women who wake up early every single day to do the honest, heavy lifting, the ones who protect their families with absolute, fierce, uncompromising loyalty, will always ultimately prevail if they act with undeniable integrity, extreme patience, and meticulous, intelligent preparation. We may get knocked down hard by the people we trust. We may have our hearts broken by the very children we raised and loved the most. We may lose our life savings and our physical strength to the grinding gears of betrayal. But if we absolutely refuse to stay down, if we stand back up, dust off our calloused working hands, and fight relentlessly for the truth, the light will always pierce through the darkness, and true absolute justice will always be served. I lost a logistics company, but I built a much stronger one from the ashes. I lost a daughter to pure vanity and greed, but I saved two beautiful innocent souls from total destruction. I am Thomas Sullivan, and I finally have my family back safe and sound right where they belong. The blueprint of betrayal they tried to force upon me was completely rewritten into a blueprint of absolute triumph, and I would do it all over again to see my grandchildren smile. Did you like my story, and which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments. If you liked the story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment your current location and time while watching this video to boost engagement. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.